Good evening. I will now call the February 24th meeting of the Ben Lapine School Board of Directors to order. I would like to introduce our participants this evening. Directors Cameron Fisher, Jen Lynch, Shirley Olson. Director Ross Tomlin is joining us virtually. Members of our budget committee in attendance are Apollo Aguirre. I apologize if I say anyone's name wrong. Kara Marsh Rhodes, Sharon Belushi, Ned Lutz, and Tasha McFarland. Board Clerk Janet Bojanowski, Chief Financial Officer Dan Emerson, and Assistant Director of Finance Nick Shane are also present, and I am Amy Tatum, Vice Chair of the Board. So we just did this, but we're going to do it again. Would you please stand, remove your hats, and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, and we will now move to agenda item 3, review of the agenda. Fellow board members, are there any changes to the agenda? And hearing no requests for changes, we will proceed with the agenda as noticed. So tonight, during today's work session, Dan Emerson, Chief Financial Officer, will be leading us through a discussion of the district's budget process. So I will now turn the meeting over to Dan.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you, Director Tatum. So first off, just to start, thank you guys, budget committee members, especially our volunteer budget committee members, for coming out today. 3 hours is a long time on a Tuesday. So, you know, I think that it will probably take around that time, but we'll go as quick as possible. A lot of it will depend on how many questions there are. There are no such thing as, you know, a bad question in this case. Part of your job is to kind of represent the community and the residents here. And so ask any questions you have. This is a little bit of a departure for us. I don't think we've really dove into our finances at this level before, but we want to make that a thing for the budget committee and for you know, our board members who are on the budget committee as well. It's a different time period that are in. Financially, you know, we're not able to continue to kind of have excess capital and reserves. And so we just want you guys to be mindful of that, especially during this budget season, over the next few budget seasons where we might be having to make some reductions and things like that to make sure we balance the budget. So. Okay, so specifically, we'll be kind of really weeding into the details on our finances. We'll be doing a fairly quick overview of our non-general funds. That would be our special revenue funds, which are grants, our debt service funds, our capital funds. We'll also be briefly talking about our trust or scholarship funds. You know, Nick and I are immersed in this every day, so either one of us could do this presentation, but I think we'll probably kind of, Nick will do some, I'll do some, and I've asked Nick that if I forget anything, you know, chime in and I'll do the same. And then I'll touch on general fund revenues, and then we'll talk about expenditures. And throughout this presentation, you'll see revenues as kind of a line that continues to grow, and then we'll talk about expenditures, and that will grow. And then eventually we'll talk about the general fund sub-funds and what those kind of fund and the transfers related to it, and we'll stack that onto the expenditures. And at the end here, you'll actually see our fund balance and reserves, not just for this fiscal year, but for the next fiscal year. And unfortunately, you will see those expenditure lines crossing over the revenue lines, which means we're operating in a deficit. And so that'll be a lot of this conversation. We'll look at the long-term forecasts, which is 5 years, and then kind of talk about what some pretty standard financial solutions would be for that. And like I said, questions are very much welcome. You know, that's how this is definitely more, I think, fiscally transparent than we've been in the past with the public. And so questions are the way that they can get their answers for those things as well. So we'll jump into it. Dr. Cook, do you have anything?
No.
And I will pass it off to Nick.
All right. We have a handful of kind of extra funds. They're really not operational in nature. And the main reason for that is that there's kind of typically a special funding source that has to be used in a specific way, and it doesn't include kind of operations and things like that. And so we're gonna kind of go over those really pretty quickly, just kind of give you an idea of what is in there. But the kind of overall picture is that these are really important and impactful things, but because of the restrictions that come with those revenues, we can't really use them in the way that we want to. It's not operational dollars. And so in reality, yes, we budget for them, we pay attention to them, but in terms of kind of our long-term financial planning, these really aren't the things that we're focusing on just because we can't do all the things that we would like to with that revenue. So the first one is our special revenue fund. And typically when you look at this, these are gonna be your grants and special awards. So, you know, again, it's a specific funding source, and then it comes kind of with restrictions on how we can use it. Also usually comes with strings in terms of reporting and all that good stuff. But again, these are kind of add-on services. The term that we hear all the time is supplement, not supplant. So we can use grant funds to supplement activities that we're already doing in our classroom, but we can't use them to replace activities that we're already doing. So it has to be kind of things that are going above and beyond what it is that we're already doing with kind of our general fund or operational dollars. And then kind of the big picture on grants is that we are kind of projecting flat or slightly downward kind of trending in revenue. You can see last year, I think it was about 57.8 million was our budgeted grant revenue, and this upcoming year, we're looking at about 56, so slightly down. Let's see if we can do this here. Oop, other way. Big one, okay. There we go. Kind of a little bit of detail on some of our grants. Again, they can't replace district operations, but these are funding really worthwhile, impactful things. As you can see, some of them, we've got elementary math and reading supports, class size reductions for historically underserved populations, counseling staff, CTE programs, language learner programs, and then there's also instructional support. Our student services or special education is largely funded through grants. And then also our nutrition program is also primarily funded through a series of state and local grants. So again, I mean, these are all really important things, but they're kind of specific revenues for specific purposes. The way that we've been able to spend those dollars so far, roughly 75% of our grants are spent on people. So that's kind of the primary way that we are going about kind of fulfilling, you know, the requirements of these grants or providing these services. And then kind of in the big picture, when you look at it, we're predicting flat to slightly downward trending grant dollars. We know that our employee costs go up every year. So when you think about it, things are getting squeezed, and if our staff get squeezed, then that becomes something else that the general fund has to absorb. And then just kind of a quick summary of our grants. The biggest ones, the student investment account is a state grant. It's about 16 million. High School Success is another state grant. That's about 5 million. Then we've got Title, Nutrition, and IDEA. Those are all federal grants. Title's about 3 million and some change. Nutrition is usually right around 5 million, and IDEA is about 3. So any questions on grants, or Dan, did you have anything to add?
I just kind of wanted to talk about that concept of getting squeezed a little bit. So I think on the previous slide, it was 56 million in special revenue, and about 75% of that, or about 40 million or so roughly, is personnel based. And so, you know, as you can see, year over year, we're actually going down in grant revenue by just a little bit. But if you think about 40 million and take a 5%, you know, personnel on that, that's a $2 million. So next year, you know, to provide those same level of services, you're talking about increasing 2 million. Unfortunately, that grant revenue will probably stay flat. And so then you have to have a conversation about, do you cut those grant activities, which, so far we have not done, or do you move those grants into the general fund, which is already in and of itself being squeezed pretty tight. And so I think that's just, realistically, that's probably the number that we're looking at being squeezed in year over year.
Just to say that one more time, move those grant activities. What you mean is move the work that those people are doing
Correct.
into something that's funded by the general fund.
Yeah, we continue to do the things that are required by the grant, but they're funded by the general fund because the grant doesn't cover the
And
personnel
so let's
increases.
say that happens and then the grant dollars go back up. Now we are supplanting what we have just made into a district activity with grant dollars, which we can't do.
I think
Yeah.
yeah, and I would say it somewhat also depends, like the uniform guidance on the federal grants is very tight. You probably couldn't do that with title funds. With SIA, you might be able to reach out to the state and say, hey, this was historically funded by the general fund, but I mean, I think the conservative thing is to say, correct.
If I may, I would like to add, the rate of increase for the state grants, they're doing their darndest to try to keep up on those, but they are not keeping up with the cost of personnel. And I think more importantly, the federal grants, we were very happy to find out we were flat funded on those federal grants, because at one point it was estimated that we were going to get funded at about 80% of what we are currently funded. And so when they came out flat, we were extremely, extremely happy. And when you think about what that means, any increase in cost that has to go into the general fund, we often reference that as, if you will, like a tax to the general fund. And so that helps people to kind of understand what that looks like. And much to your point, Director Lynch, whether or not we can move those costs back into the federal grant, should those dollars be larger in future years, sometimes we absolutely can, and sometimes we cannot.
In general, there's less flexibility with the federal dollars than the state dollars. And the state dollars, make up the vast majority of that, if I would have to guess. I think SIA is 15 million in high school success, so. Yeah. Thanks, Dave.
I have a question. And it's kind of a standing question as we go throughout the entire story that you're putting together. How are you incorporating and thinking about policy changes like HR 1 in grants and other decisions we're making?
Yeah, I think it would depend on the specific parts of HR 1, right? There's quite a few parts. I mean, do you have a specific thing that you're thinking of in terms of that? I mean, I think we believe that federal funding is flat right now for title. So
Okay.
that was kind of the largest thing, I would say,
Okay.
on our side.
And that's the federal grant piece of that? Okay. Yeah, I'm just interested in, I know how, I'm familiar with how those things impact healthcare, but I'm curious how they impact education, so.
I can speak to that.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I can speak to that. I think that the first thing to say is that the majority of the impact of HR 1 was on health and human services parts of the budget for the state. What the pressure that puts on is when we start negotiating, if you will, with legislators about how to meet this year's expectations. The governor doesn't see the budget of the state in buckets. The governor sees the budget as a whole, much like we do for the district. We don't see it as buckets. We do the best we can to keep the whole thing floating. And so when we get asked how the state might consider making 2.5% to 5% reductions across the board to be able to make the budget work, there are over 50 grants that that ODE is a pass-through agency for support in public schools, along with the state school fund, which would also, that's the primary tool of revenue for all school districts. When you talk about a 2.5% to 5% reduction in any of those directly impact kids. That's the first thing. The second one I think is important to tell is when we start talking about whether or not the state is going to discuss decoupling from the federal tax code. Now we're talking about the primary focus of our legislators and whether or not the tax cuts that were a part of HR 1 are there for Oregonians as well. And so now you hear legislation being proposed to do a partial decoupling, and there does seem to be some interest in that. And what that does is increase the overall state revenue. And any way you cut it, the overall revenue that happens in the state is going to be a driver of how the state school fund comes to bear. And that's why we have to pay very much attention to what the feds are doing, because not only is it direct funding from them for these grants and special funds, but also how it impacts the overall state budget.
There's quite a few things in the long-term forecast too. I'll just tag along with Dr. Cook. I think it puts pressure on the state's budget, right? Because their largest budget is the Medicaid Health and Human Services budget, and they need to shore that up, right? And so you get a little afraid that maybe some pots of money that have formerly been put maybe towards education or other pieces might be siphoned off to shore that up. I don't think we'll know about that until next year. And I mean, I think the biggest place that I worry about it is probably in our long-term forecast. We have like a 1% PERS rate relief in there, and I get a little worried that that money is maybe could get pulled out of education-related PERS, and that would have a couple $1 million impact on us. But it's still pretty early to say. Yeah.
Good questions. The next kind of group of funds is our debt service fund. And so these are dollars that come into us from property tax levies, and they're specifically used to pay for our capital construction bonds. So it is really just a super limited thing. We levy taxes, we get tax dollars, and then we pay our bondholders. So it's, again, a really restricted source of revenue and can't be used for any other purpose than just paying our debt. And then because that use is so restricted, we think about it in terms of our long-range planning and what our debt is and all of those kinds of things, but in terms of how we are going to fund teachers in classrooms and things along those lines, it really doesn't impact our core operations. And then just kind of a quick overview, our expected debt service expenditures are going up about $2.5 million next year. I just have one slide on debt service. Any questions on that one? Okay. The next one is very related. It's capital projects. So again, these are the funds that come from the sale of bonds, and then really the only thing that we can do with those dollars is to do kind of our maintenance and construction of all of our facilities. So again, it's a really specific source of funds, and then it has a very specific source of uses or kind of ways that you can use it. And again, it's one of those things where this is hugely impactful for our district, and in a roundabout way impacts students and learning and all those kinds of things. However, again, it's not something that we can use to pay for our operations. It doesn't turn on the lights and doesn't put teachers in classrooms. So again, it's something that we think about, we plan for, but isn't a part of kind of our core operations planning. As far as our capital projects right now, we have Bend High as our biggest project. And then we also have a variety of smaller projects that are going throughout the district. So we have a couple project managers in our facilities office, and they're running around all over the place working on various different things. And then for next year, we've got a slight reduction in what our expected spending is on capital projects. And the primary reason for that is that Bend High is transitioning between phases. And so I think in that process, there's going to be, a little bit of a slowdown, while they're transitioning. So that's kind of the big piece there.
And just a reminder on that, 89 projects are what we assigned those dollars to, just short of $250 million. That was from a list of over 400 requests, and I just want to make sure that that remains at the forefront. We're getting ready to start the sites and facilities process again for about 2 to 3 years out to start having these conversations for what might those needs be again. We will see some of those 400 items show up again. We're just, for your information, we are insured for about $900 million worth of facilities for all across the district. And so when you think of that in square footage and how much upkeep and maintenance that requires, that's why these numbers are large.
Aside from Ben High, what's maybe the second and third largest project right now?
There's a cafeteria going in at Buckingham. There is a second gym going, auxiliary gym going in at Skyview. There is 3,700 doors getting upgraded and new locks, and I think that might be finished by now. Then a lot of work on what Juniper hasn't happened yet, but Juniper will have some work done. But I am totally blanking, like the earthquake, when you make buildings earthquake. Oh, we've got seismic. Thank you. That was the word I was looking for. I knew it was out there somewhere. Seismic upgrades across many of our buildings.
Still on that note, sorry, with the realms shift into Buckingham, will there be any significant improvements there?
We're still working that out. There will be some.
Okay, I'll wait. Thanks.
Okay. The next and actually last kind of supplemental group of funds is our trust funds. And these are primarily kind of endowments or donations to the district. And the primary way that they get used is in the form of student scholarships. So it's, really an impactful thing for our students. But again, when we get these donations, they come with kind of specific instructions about how we will manage funds on behalf of, the donors, and then what we're going to do with them. And typically what that means is that the principle of the donation stays in place, and then whatever earnings come about every year gets passed out to students as scholarships. So again, it's hugely impactful for the students that receive those in terms of kind of the overall place in our operational budget. You can see, our expenditures next year are expected to be about $60,000. It's not a very significant overall expense. And again, these aren't dollars that we can repurpose for our own use, so they kind of have to be used that way. And that we look at them as important things, but again, not kind of a core operation. And then you'll notice that there's a pretty significant increase in spending between 26 and 27 in terms of our budget. And the big reason is that we got a couple big scholarships this year, 2 new ones, so that's pretty cool. Those, I believe, the 3 latest ones, which are all pretty significant, were in memoriam for Haley King, Karen Corwin, and Donald Edwards. A couple other long-term scholarships that we've had: Adrian Irwin, Doug Harris, Dave Kuhn, Sarah Mace, former Superintendent Ron Wilkinson and his wife Gail have a big scholarship that they do every year. And then also the administrators throughout the district contribute usually a donation every month, and it goes into a big pot, and that gets awarded in terms of scholarships to students at the end of the year too. Any questions on trust funds?
Okay, moving right along. So we'll move to the general fund, which is obviously our major fund. It holds the vast majority of our resources. Typically, the appropriations land around $250 million. So this is where most of our operations come from, and therefore it's where the vast majority of our long-term forecast is located and concentrated on too. So the general fund is our default fund. It holds all revenues and expenditures that are not legally restricted for other purposes. It's made up of 2 distinct parts: general fund operations and then the general fund sub-funds. And Nick will talk about the sub-funds. Sometimes they're, I would say, a misnomer. They're called our reserve funds. They are not reserve funds, and so we'll go through the function of those funds. We'll cover the state school fund, which covers the majority of revenues and maintains our district operational reserves. And actually, right now, there should be a video showing here. There should be about a 15-minute, the state school fund is 95% of our general fund resources, and because it's so important, I actually made a 15-minute video for us to watch, which will be perfect timing with our food. But we have to get the video up there, so we'll see if we can do that, so. In the meantime, though, it might be a good time to take a break and get food. Sure.
operations. It's very important that we understand this, so I'm going to spend a good amount of time. Hi, everyone. Today we're going to go over the state school fund grant. It's 95% of our general fund revenues. It funds most of our operations. It's very important that we understand this, so I'm going to spend a good amount of time on two tables from the Oregon Department of Education. One will be our estimate of total state school fund payment for this year, and we'll talk about how it relates to next year. And the other will be how we do a breakout of our ADMW. Both are very important to understand kind of the levers with respect to this SSF revenue and certainly the most important revenue that will be going over and has the largest impacts to the school district. So if you have any questions when we're done with this, please feel free to ask me. This is a really important kind of area that we understand and that you can see kind of the levers and evaluate these sheets yourself. So first off, what is the state school fund? It's the largest payment, obviously, but it's a mixture of both what is classified as local revenue and state revenue. And everybody's local revenue, aka everybody's property taxes from every district in the state, come into the state school fund revenue pool, and then they take those property taxes and they disperse them back out, and they fluctuate the state funding based on those property taxes so that everybody's funded roughly equal except for a couple things within the formula. So in that way, even though our property tax is growing much higher than most regions in the state, our property taxes, probably our assessed value, varies between 4.5 and 5% increases a year. So what that means is you can take this property tax number here and you can basically multiply it by 4.7, and you'll probably be roughly plus or minus 500,000 of our property tax collections. Other districts might barely be getting the max of 3% without new growth, right? And so other districts are not growing as fast as us. But we don't really actually have an advantage in that because all this property tax dollars funds back into the state school fund revenue. And because we have a little bit more property tax growth than most places, we actually just get a little bit less SSF, the state portion, and it all kind of evens out. But it is very important to know that the largest number in the sum of the local revenue pool is going to be this property tax. We estimate 114 million for this year, 4.7% growth on this for next year. Common school fund stays basically the same every year. It's fairly flat. Same with the county school fund. These are kind of ORS related local revenues that go into the total of the SSF revenue. So you can see local revenue, or that portion of local revenue that's going into the SSF pot, is 116 million, and it's just the sum of these three, the total of those three numbers. We're going to skip out on transportation grant for now. We'll be back there in a second, but we are going to talk about this interesting experience adjustment. And this is kind of one of the only other ways besides enrollment that you can leverage your state school fund, and basically the state will pay you a slight more if you have teachers with more years of experience than the state average. So you can see the state average is basically 12 years. We're sitting pretty close to 14.5. The difference between the two, if you were to subtract them, is 2.36 years. And this is actually going to be a pretty important number. This is going to factor into the total formula revenue, or the general purpose revenue. And we're going to talk about that in a second, but hold on to that number real quick. And we're going to move into ADMW, which is kind of our average daily attendance weighted. And this is really important. I mean, this is basically this is the largest factor with relation to leveraging payment. This is related to enrollment. ADMR is our enrollment of about 16,100, right? And then ADMW is an increase on that enrollment based upon certain factors that a student population might have within our district. And so I'm going to go ahead and show you the ADMW breakout in a second. But before I do that, I just want to remind folks, or you may not be aware, that the state's really nice. They give us the two of the 2 years of the current year or the last year. They give us the highest ADMW, and they call that the extended ADMW. And so last year our enrollment's gone down. So last year our enrollment with ADMW was 19,294. This year's 19,106. We get paid, per this ADMW, and so we want to have a higher number. We want to have more enrollment, and they are actually give us the lagged ADMW or the extended ADMW of 19,294. That's actually what our payment is based off in this fiscal year. So when your enrollment is declining, we are estimating that it will decline. We estimate that the 26-27 ADMW will be, a good 300 or so points lower than this, but we will still receive payment for this number because it will be the highest of those 2 years. And that's important to know as well. All right, let's get into how we actually calculate the ADMW. We're going to go to the ADMW breakout. We also get this sheet from the state. These are also estimates from us. And then, they kind of hear more about it as time goes up. We continue these estimates. So right now, they don't have the Bend Charter School in here. So that's why this ADMR is going to look a little bit large. We're actually not sitting at 16,515. That includes Bend Charter School. It also includes Desert Sky Montessori right now. Bend International School. So this number is actually going to be closer to 16, probably 100. Our students in EL programs, you can see, so for your base enrollment or your ADMR, you get one weight. And so for every student you get a weight. And so we have about 16,100. We'll get about 16,100 here. We do have about 800 students or more actually in the EL program this year. This number is a little bit low. So we'll get 400, or when they do the true up, probably closer to 450 additional ADMW there. We have two kind of teens in a parenting program who have children, so that's a 1.0 weight there. And then this is kind of our second largest ADMW factor, and it would be the IEP students capped at 11% of the district. We get a double weight for them too, so another one. We also now have students above 11% of the ADMR, and that's actually not just, do you have more than 11% over? It's a percentage plus the acuity of those students. So there are some districts that have more than 11% of their students on IEPs, but they don't actually receive this double weight because of the acuity of the distribution of those students. And so this is our first year being in there. It's not very much, but we do have some. And then the third largest would be students in poverty, right? And so you get a quarter weight for that. And then students in foster care. And then there's some other smaller ones down here. When you do the whole thing, you come up with 19,106.94 for us. And so that is, again, there's some charter school breakout in here. You can see last year was actually 18,901, so we'll probably be somewhere in the 18,700s by the time this is all done. But this extended ADMW included the charter schools last year with 223 at BIS and 169 at Desert Sky Montessori to give us the 19,294. That's similar numbers at BIS and similar numbers at Desert Sky Montessori. We'll probably be looking pretty close to this 19,106 since those base enrollment numbers are inside of our ADMR up here. But this is how we come up with ADMR. This is kind of the categories that receive double weight. As folks know, in terms of enrollment, we continue to lose enrollment year over year, a couple hundred students, sometimes a little less, sometimes a little bit more. But we also continue to grow our EL program, and we continue to have more IEP students. So more English language learning students, more IEP students. So although we are losing overall ADMR, we are increasing kind of our double weights because the acuity of our students is a little bit higher, especially when you are talking about IEP and English language learning students. So these are how we come up with our numbers. Going back to this sheet, basically you can expect ADMW to continue to drop for a little bit just because of the natural decrease in enrollment is going to be greater than the increases we might see in double weight from IEP and English language learners or students in poverty. And so we will probably continue for some years to continue to get the extended ADMW, but I would imagine that this will continue to drop by, 150, 200 points a year. And while that's very concerning that our enrollment is going down, it should be noted that really how you're paid out of ADMW is what is the percent of ADMW that in your district to all of Oregon, right? To all the districts in Oregon. And while we're declining, we're actually not declining as fast as some of the larger districts. There are districts whose enrollment are declining even faster. So even though we're maybe declining by 100 to 200, there are districts that are declining by 5%. And for those, and because of that, our ADMW is staying relatively flat as a proportion of the entire state school fund. We're relatively flat at about 2.9% of that because all of Oregon, by and large, is losing enrollment. So we maintain the same general percentage of SSF funding out of the whole pocket, even though we're declining. And that's really important to know that we're not the only ones in this boat. In fact, in some ways, our enrollment for a large district may not be declining as fast as some others. So we're going to multiply, we're going to go back to this number here, this 2.36, weird number. It comes in here. We're going to multiply the teacher experience adjustment of 2.36 by $25. And then we're going to add $4,500 to the result to come up with $4,600. So this is the formula for the general purpose grant. So we're at 4,600 and we multiply that by our extended ADMW, right? The highest ADMW of the last 2 years, that 19,294. And then we're going to multiply it by a secret funding ratio that the state has, and that number is 2.47916. And you can see that for everybody, it's the same. Here we go down to Redmond, they're 2.47 as well. If we go back up to Curry County, Brookings Harbor, 2.479. So that is a funding ratio. Folks aren't quite sure how that number is calculated, but that is the number for all districts. And so you take your 4,600, you multiply it by your extended ADMW, and then you multiply it again by the funding ratio, and you come up with your total general purpose grant, which for all effective purposes is the amount that kind of flows into general fund operations, and it's 218 million. So that would be your combined state portion with your local portion of SSF. You're also going to get 70% of your net eligible transportation expenditures, so back. And so the transportation reimbursement rate is 70%. So SSF will pay us $9 million, 9 to 10 million each year, kind of, and expenditures. It grows, as the COLA and cost of materials and equipment grow with relation to transportation and buses. So we add that and we get 227 million. And so the last kind of portion is to see how much of this is coming from local revenue and then how much is coming back from state. And so they kind of send us back all of our property taxes and all of our local revenue, and they say, okay, you're getting 116 million. Your total revenue is 227. So how much of that from the state is 111, right? So we have, when we do a budget, we'll have about 116 in local revenue and about 111 in state revenue. And those two combined make up our state school fund. And so then the question is kind of what are the rates per ADMW? This is all kind of defined throughout here, but the general purpose grant is you get about 11,302 per extended ADMW. So for each one of these, you get $11,000, right? Total formula includes the transportation grant. So you get 11,700 there. Things that kind of change, fluctuate. If you estimate your property taxes too low, the state's actually going to send you more state revenue, right? Because instead of this being 116, they're going to say, if we estimate 114, the state would have 114 here, they'd send us 113. And at the end of the year, they'd say, oh, actually you collected 116 and we'd have a big payback. We'd need to pay them back a couple $1 million, right? Because they would have paid us too much SSF. And that is a situation that we, do not want to find ourselves in. So we often estimate our local revenue, like right almost exactly where we think it is, maybe even slightly high on the taxes, because we don't want to be in a situation where we collected less than we budgeted for, and therefore they gave us more state funds and claw back more the year following in that May period. That's always a tough hit. So we try our best to mitigate that. Same thing goes for ADMW. If you, send your ADMW estimates to the state and they're too high, you know, they will pay you for a large portion of the year based on those ADMW estimates. And then when they true them up, if they were too high, you know, say they were too high by, you know, 100 students, well, it's going to be 100 times this rate, and you're going to be looking at paying back quite a bit of money. So those are kind of two things that we look for, is to make sure that we fully budget for those revenues and are conservative when we think about, or sorry, are you know, trying to put in the highest assessed value rate as possible when we look at those taxes, so that we don't have a payback there, and also that we're kind of conservative with our ADMW. We don't want to be overly optimistic going in with our next year enrollment projections, because that can really bite you if they don't come in that way. And so that is pretty much the entirety of this sheet and the SSF. If you have any other questions, I am available. Thanks. Bye.
Video Dan volunteered, present Dan, to answer questions.
I don't think I'll be doing that again. It's really hard to watch yourself on video for 15 minutes. That was rough. Yeah, and then there wasn't a lot of editing there. It was a one take. So a couple things I want to address, though, is the 2.4791608552884. That is kind of a secret number. There have been multiple colleagues that have tried to, you know, reach out to the state. I have not personally tried yet, but I've kind of heard that funding ratio is not something that we have access to. So,
I guess my first question is okay, so my first question is, the SSF estimate from 2 days ago is 2.4879976445526. So like, it not only is it bizarre, but it also seems to just change.
it does, yeah. I think it changes based on the ADMW. As they look at real-time ADMW, that ADMW total pool for Oregon fluctuates, and then I think they can fund more or less, given that they hold back like a $20 million
So
reserve.
that fall, I guess, okay.
One thing, the thing that is constant is the total amount that they're going to pay out.
Totally.
And so I think they're working in different ways to ratio so that when they get done at the end of the year, at the end of the biennium, they've paid 11.359 billion, and everything else is how do we distribute that as fairly as they can.
What does it mean? So overall Oregon student enrollment is down like 15,000 kids in the last 4 years. What does it mean that like the total number of students keeps going down? Is that, like, are we gonna see proportionately more money because the number of Oregonians isn't going down at the same rate? Or like, what do you think that means?
I think that's a potential. I mean, I've looked into forecasting that. It's difficult to forecast. I'd say that a lot of the some of the Beaverton, Salem, Portland are actually seeing 5% drops, which is certainly more than us when you think about the fact that we're only seeing maybe 200, 300 kid drop a year. That's only off the top of, 1.5%. So, but then it's interesting, you're seeing rural schools, and you actually are seeing some of the other districts too, where as I go through and look at the total Oregon ADMW, they're not using their extended ADMW, which means that their current ADMW is growing, but I don't think it's growing at the rate that we're seeing, like kind of this movement away from urban districts. So it is possible. I am trying to forecast that. It's very difficult. We do have the new Flow Analytics enrollment, which I might be able to do some of that, but obviously there's assumptions about how much Oregon is growing or not growing. I think that in my current forecast, we go up a little bit, but I'm talking 2.9 to like 2.95%, which isn't huge, but it's also a little conservative.
It's also not down.
Yeah.
But it also sort of implies that, like, if we were to staunch the enrollment bleeding, we could grow our percentage, right? That would be a way of
Correct. You could, if you decline
just thinking
ahead.
that there may be more than one good reason to like try and staunch the enrollment bleeding. Like, not just like we get more revenue per kid, but also our percentage of the total state school fund starts to grow if we have more kids here.
Yeah, one of the things, and this will be part of another presentation that we'll be giving here soon, which the flow analytics analysis demonstrated that there is a substantial increase in number of students that you get in housing units when they are affordable housing units. So a development that has like primarily condos, will get 1 student per every 20 units. When you have 60% of AMI, like Verdes Pine, which was, I think, 128 units, we anticipate that to be about 0.55, so 1 per 2. And so when we talk about, the overall number one factor as to what can be significantly increasing or decreasing our enrollment, we are talking about affordability of housing in our school district. Specific kinds of housing.
And yes, that's correct. If our enrollment declines slower than everyone else, then yes, we could potentially get more of the overall dollar amount of the SSF. And I would say the thing that kind of counteracts that is, even though, ADMW is a factor of all those factors that we just saw, including your IEP percentage and, students in poverty or EL. And I would say there are definitely school districts whose IEP amount is still growing at faster than us or has a little bit higher acuity. When you look at this sheet, you'll see that there's a double weighted portion for students on IEP above 11% of ADMR. And we're actually at about 12.8 or something like that percent, but we're only getting credit for 4.8 students. And that's because just when you look at the total acuity of our students and things like that, the state isn't quite willing to give us that portion over the top. So there are other districts, even Redmond, who's getting, more than that. So it's not just kind of our enrollment, it's also the makeup of our students. So.
And one thing I would add to that is that high-cost disability is not a part of the state school fund. It's a separate grant. And so you apply to the state. It's an equalized grant, so every district has the same right to apply based on the number of students that qualify. And it doesn't qualify until you've spent over $30,000 on a student. But once you've spent that, if you think about a student on an IEP, and if we use easy math, double funded at $11,000, that's about $22,000. And then that $8,000 difference, the school district is expected to eat that for a student. And then the costs that are above that, all districts across the state can apply for a reimbursement of that. And so last year, the grant amount was $110 million for every district across the state. And so once every district applies for that amount, it's evenly distributed. And our return on that rate was 27 cents on the dollar. And so you can see how between having 11% cap on students qualifying with IEPs and being funded at that rate and not above, and that cap, if you will, on high-cost disability, between those two, we estimate the tax on the general fund for those two at right about $8.4 million.
And can you remind me the number of kids we have who fall under high-cost disability? Is it 16?
Oh, no, it was about 160,
166,
yeah, about 160, I think, last year. I'd have to check to double check that number.
Was there some breakdown of, I'm trying to remember, was there some breakdown of type of disability under that?
I don't think so. Do you know?
It's cost-based. It's,
Yeah.
Okay.
is it 30,000? Yeah. So anybody that costs more than
Be above
30,000, and
And
I
we
think
had over 100 of kids who were above that.
generally speaking, there's certain diagnoses that, are
that's-
going to be like, yes, that's it, but not that qualify for high costs. It's just so we know that if you're, visually impaired, plus you have hearing disabilities, you're probably going to go over that threshold and qualify for high cost disability.
Okay, thank you. And I had another question, and this, Dan, I appreciate this, especially having the papers to follow along. I would have liked that to be a little larger for my eyes, but once I got these, it was great.
Agreed.
And maybe I misunderstood this with regard to charter schools, and I don't see Desert Sky on here, I just see Ben International. Maybe I'm missing this somewhere. But, so, is it typical that charter schools do not qualify for weighted for these different categories?
They do, and so this is kind of deceiving, and that's what I was trying to say is, first off, the second page of this is missing. I don't know where Desert Sky is, but Desert Sky should be in here.
I was like,
Typically,
what am I missing? Yeah.
typically in the beginning of the year, the state front loads all the ADMW into Ben Lapine. And then by the time you hit November and these estimates, they start moving the ADMW out from Ben Lapine schools into the charter schools. And that's what's happening here is that our true ADMW is not 19,106.94. That's what our ADMW is if they were to complete the ADMW for Bend International Schools and Desert Sky Montessori. And so they're missing those estimates right now, but I'll tell you that if you look up the ADMR, which is our standard enrollment, it says 16,515, and our enrollment is 16,100. And so that's the gap. There's about 415, 420 students that are in BIS and charter school, and they should, for some reason this year, they haven't put it in there yet, but in prior years, they would have already distributed the ADMW and taken it out of this 19,100. That's why I think that our actual ADMW will probably be about 18,700. And they do qualify, BIS and Desert Sky Montessori do qualify for all the same categories that we do
Okay,
as
so-
well.
So when you say they haven't put those numbers in, who, do you mean
The state,
has
the
not
state.
entered in charter schools?
Yes,
Okay,
they have the data, the charter schools,
they're just running behind.
exactly.
Well,
Okay.
and you just rattled off some numbers that don't match what we were told in October. So it changes, it just keeps changing?
With respect to what? The
Oh, just
enrollment?
like October, it was 16,068 without the charters and J and stuff.
Yeah, I think it's, yeah, so that's probably, that would be probably accurate, as opposed to 16,100.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so can you just, and maybe you've already said this, can you give me a ballpark of the amount of money? Like, so when we are advocating for those high-cost disability, which didn't go anywhere last spring, but in the future, what for Ben Lapine, what is kind of the ballpark amount that we're paying over that 11%?
About 4 million.
Okay,
I think we're getting about 1.7, and we claim about 5.7 to 6 million.
and 27, what'd you say, 27 cents?
Yeah, the 27 cents on the dollar was last year's claim rate, if you will. And so if you wanted to do the math, high-cost disability, we estimate about 4 million, and the cost to our general fund for underfunding the cap, if you will, is 4.3 million. Between the two of them, we estimate it's about a little over $8 million.
Thank you.
And on about a $240 million general fund budget.
Are there any other questions related to ADMW or the state school fund? Okay. I just want to touch really quickly on this slide where we say the district SSF allocation is calculated as follows and it has the teacher experience ratio. I do want to say, like, that's, it's pretty great that we have that 2.36. You know, that means that our district teachers are, you know, more experienced on average. They're veterans. And it's also important to note, because I'm going to skip ahead here, but one of the strategies that I have heard other districts potentially consider is kind of doing, I don't want to call it severance pay, but incentives to go out. And I just want this as the financial committee to be aware of that, because if you were to incentivize that and a lot of your veteran teachers leave at one point in time, you can see a pretty drastic drop on that 2.36 leverage on that ratio, right? Because now your average teacher drops, and you could, so that's an important thing that I don't hear a lot of people having that conversation. How much SSF are we losing when we incentivize our veterans to go out there? So,
And it looks like the Redmond number is 0.63 for our 2 point whatever. Like, it's a huge difference, huge difference.
I have a comment, not to be simplistic, but generally, people think that whatever property taxes we collect within our district comes right to us, right? They do not understand that all the property taxes go to the state, and then the state divvies out our general fund, our school state fund. So how can we communicate that, Dan? Just that simply, you know? I know it sounds ridiculous when we get into the real nitty-gritty of it, but there is a concept that whatever we raise here, we get directly.
yeah.
And if there could be maybe 3 or 4 sentences that just say, you know, everybody contributes across the state, it goes to the state, and then the state figures out how to divvy it back out to the districts without complicating it. with all, based on, and the fact that it's based on enrollment, that's good. People kind of know that. They don't know anything about the teacher factor. They don't know anything about a whole lot of the other things. But I don't mean to be, whatever the right word is, but people just don't understand state funding in general, and certainly not state school funds. So if we could have a little message thing of, a few sentences that just says, a reminder.
That's a great idea, and I'll put it down
For
on
the
the notes.
layperson.
Yeah, I'm still working on it. You can tell from my 15-minute video. So, but right, we're capped. The more property taxes we make, the less state fund we make, and everybody is around the same when you talk about enrollment. So we can work on some messaging for that, certainly. And I think that's a really important thing, because when you think about the county or the city and the assessed value growth that they have, they're able to leverage their general fund. It's all based off that 4.7% property tax. And we are not. Like, we get that property tax, and then on the back end, we get, reduced with the school state fund. And so where a lot of counties and cities are able to fund services based off increased growth and assessed value, that's not how schools work. So
Thanks
that's
very much.
important. Sure.
One of the things that, when I first got here, that I learned about is the way that they speak about the state school fund is not that it is the way that it is funding schools. It is the way that it equalizes property tax collections so that everybody is funded in a similar manner.
Okay, moving forward. So we talked about this a little bit, but the state, the SSF revenue, the state school fund is primarily driven by two factors. You're gonna have the general fund dollars and the lottery funds there at the state level. A higher forecast for those means a projection of greater statewide personal and corporate tax income revenue. And that's really the main driver of the state school fund. So if we're getting a pretty positive economic forecast with relation to those two things, it's possible that the governor will put a higher state school fund in her budget. And as long as we're 2.9% of that, that's a great deal. But we do rely a lot on, and moreover, our legislatures, I think, rely a lot on these economic forecasts that come out. And if the economic forecast before the governor's budget next December is a little doom and gloom, you can expect that that number is not going to be as high as we'd want, because that's ultimately saying that they're not going to bring as much general fund into their state budget with corporate and personal income tax. So sometimes an increased state budget leads to an increased total state school fund allocation. Sometimes, with HR 1 and some other things, it's just a little bit more up in the air this year, I think. So the second factor is student enrollment. It's key to the state school fund revenue. We've already been over ADMW and how that's applied. I will just kind of skip to the bottom there and say that decreased enrollment can have an adverse effect on district ADMW. We know that we're not decreasing at the same rate as some other districts, so we're okay right now. But the next slide is the enrollment trends here.
Yeah, before we jump into enrollment, I just want to highlight an economic forecast issue that has been very important. Last year, you might have heard us talk a lot about current service level, CSL. And part of that was because one of the things that's unique about Oregon is based upon what the state economists say the growth rate will be, determines, quite frankly, the cap of which economic advantages can be presented to state government, because if it exceeds that amount, then we have a constitutional part of our tax law that requires that money to be given back in the form of a kicker to taxpayers. And so part of what is a significant factor when you pay attention to what economic forecasts and what the state economists are saying is how much range they are allowing for that growth. Because if they put a small growth rate and we exceed it, all of that becomes kicker. If they put a large growth rate and we fall short of that, then there's probably political trouble. And so the idea of economists trying to hit that number exactly or be a little low so that taxpayers are happy for a large kicker, for example, means that's a real potential financial impact to all state agencies, including state schools. So.
Thank you. Okay, so enrollment trends, as we said, the enrollment continues to trend down. Unfortunately, again, this is a slide that's too small, but that trend, That number right there that we've budgeted based off of FY '26 is 15,976. And I think I took the number from October 10th for 2025, which was 16,137. So you can see that there's, we're expecting another 140, or 150, excuse me, students down. If you were to take, 2019's enrollment and compare it with what we're projecting right now, that's actually a loss of $22 million in state school fund in 1 year, right? So that's kind of the lost revenue that you can think of when you think about like not holding enrollment flat to some degree. Post 2019, we did have an infusion of ESSER funds, the COVID-19 relief funds, to support pandemic academic recovery, mental and physical health. But we no longer are receiving those funds, obviously, and it's difficult to support similar staffing levels with declining enrollment. And so we've been making adjustments, I think, over the last few years where we've cut based on attrition. And I'm hesitant to say this number, but I think we're in the hundreds at this point in time over the last few years. But it still maybe is not quite up with ESSER and just with general enrollment declines. And frankly, on the other side of this, as we'll talk about, it's not keeping pace with kind of the personnel expenditure increases.
And just on a sidebar, and this is important for how you talk to folks when they ask, when ESSER dollars were kind of fill the gap. And if you recall, the standard increase year over year, biennium over biennium, has been an average across the last 20 years, about 10 biennia, about 10 to 11% increase biennium to biennium. The year that we got the ESSER funds, that biennia increase was 1.5%. And so think about that for a second. When you have ESSER dollars that fill that gap, and they did a wonderful job of filling that gap, but those were one-time monies. And so when we talk about missing revenue, if they would have funded us at 10%, or even just decreased us by the amount of the ESSER dollars and funded us at, say, for example, 8.5%, those dollars would be in our revenue sources today. They are not. And so all school districts, when people are asking, why do school districts continue to fuss about not having those dollars? That's a very real reason why. That is a large amount of money that never did get infused once those ESSER dollars were gone.
No, those are great. So the district did commission the statistical analysis through Flow Analytics, and I think we're going to do more information on that. But it doesn't, the future enrollment trends don't change significantly from kind of this graph right here. So you do see kind of downward analysis, and so when we're talking about our long-term forecast and what we look at, we have to take that into consideration as well. Next slide is a really interesting slide, and basically it's the K-12 state school funding and grants percentage of state budget. And so at the very top there, you can see that initially in 2003, that was 44% of the state budget, was going to kind of schools and state school fund. Right now in probably it's worse, this only goes to 23, 25. It was about at 34%. And so there's kind of this declining budget, I would say, for the state side. In the meantime, expenditures have kind of continued to increase on the state. And this is what this graph is kind of showing. The quality educational model believed that there needed to be about $2 billion more to support optimal student outcomes here, and that would be about an additional $58 million for BLS. So if you had been going based on what they were funding in 2003, there's quite a big difference, and that's part of the problem that schools are facing right now, is learning how to cope with, frankly, a smaller slice of the state budget, I would say. And we're not immune to the lack of state funding. I've kind of hinted at a couple times that other school districts are doing this, but just off the top of my head, and Dr. Cook can chime in here, I think Eugene is cutting $30 million this year, a couple hundred staff. Reynolds is cutting. Hillsborough did, I think, mid-year cuts. Portland's cutting $50 million. Yeah, someone else is cutting 20.
Springfield is,
Yeah.
did mid-year cuts, and Salem Kaiser's cutting 25
20.
million.
Yeah, and that's just what we know so far. So, probably more will pop up. So we're in a lot better, I think, situation in some ways than some of those places, but we're in the same boat. We're maybe lagging a year or two behind, or handling kind of the strategies a little differently, but we're still there, so. So let's talk about the budget. The budget is just looking at 1 year. The long-term forecast looks at 5 years, but this is important, especially for the budget committee, when you look at approving the proposed budget. The current biennium is based off 11.36 billion. FY '26 was when we received that state school funding. So we know that FY '27 is going to be about 236.6 million. They always fund 49% of that 11.3 in the first biennium, in the first year of the biennium, and 51 in the second. And so unless your ADMW drastically changes, you're going to get pretty close to that 49.51. So that's where we are. There we project about 122 million in taxes and local revenue and 114 in state funds. The state biennium forecast so when we talk about our long-term forecast, we look out 2 bienniums to fiscal year 28 and fiscal year 30. And our long-term forecast is a pretty adaptable tool where we can do a bunch of different modeling, but for the revenue and expenditure lines you're going to see here, we're projecting 11% total increase, which is basically the average in fiscal year 28 and in fiscal year 30. So if you were to take out that ESSER year, the average has basically been about 11%. Some would say maybe that's a little optimistic given some of the economic forecasts and just the general volatility, but that is based off the scenarios you'll be seeing tonight. We have that is nearly 2% higher than the last decade of SSF biennial increase average, but that did include those ESSER funds that Dr. Cook put in there, and that's a big asterisk. We are estimating that we retain 2.9% of total ADMW. I mean, right now, maybe we could trend up to 2.95, 2.97, but again, that's not the most fiscally conservative projection, so we're staying there. And even though, we're losing enrollment, we do see slow increases in SPED and ELL still. I don't know how long those will continue. They really were, especially with SPED. I mean, it was 100 students a year, and now it's looking like it's starting to cap off a little bit. So basically in FY '28-29, that's 250.5 million in revenues and 260.8 in state school fund revenues. And I'm gonna.
Can you go back? I'm sorry. I
Yes.
just want to go back to one more time, one more. This, just because it's such a crazy slide, that number, the 21-23 number of 10.5 billion in the state school fund, that's the entire state school fund. And again, that's based on 15,000 more students in the state than the 11.7 billion is based on, right? Am I right? Okay.
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I haven't seen the total ADMW. Off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you that, but that sounds about right.
But this number, the big blue bar continues to go up as the number of kids we are educating in the state is continuing to go down. Okay.
Yes, that's a good point too. Okay. So the revenue projection, this is the first of like multiple slides where we're going to stack revenues on top of each other and we're going to stack expenditures and you're going to see them cross over. This is just going out to FY '29. By that time we hit the end, we'll put in FY '30, but that's a representation of the revenue that we just talked about in the budget and the long-term assumptions. So then we get to all other general fund operational revenues. It's a slide worth talking about, but it's only $6.5 million. So it's not nearly, this is in the budget for next year. If you look at the top where it says for revenues, that's the subtotal of all those lines. So that is what we're budgeting right now, $6.567 million in additional revenues. So when you think about our general fund, obviously 95% of that is the state school fund. So we're highly dependent there. High Desert ESD revenue is less than fiscal year '26 by almost $1 million because we had $1 million basically sitting in fund balance with the ESD, and we pulled that because we're looking at operational reductions. So obviously we need to kind of scrounge all the couch cushions, and that was one of them. So we pulled that, and there won't be any more money coming from that. So we just kind of get that payment that they provide us for services, which is $2.3 million. Interest on investments, this is a big one too. It's a function of rates and cash balance, and it's decreasing year over year. And this is, a few years ago, if we were to look back at financials, we were sitting at about 3 million interest on investments. And two things are happening. Our general fund balance is decreasing, which is a good representation of what we get interest on for our operations. And the rates are down to 3-point-something% instead of 5-point-something%. And so next year, I mean, it's hard to absorb a $2 million loss on interest in investments. And unfortunately, even if rates climb a little bit with the continued reserve losses, we just don't have the principal sitting in the bank or in our investments to continue to get that kind of interest rate. Our projection going forward has general fund other revenues remaining flat, which could be a little bit optimistic when we talk about interest on investments. But those are the two major revenues. One thing that's really saving us from having to make more drastic operational moves this year is that we are going to be moving $2.9 million or about $3 million in from debt service. As I talk about, kind of looking through the couch cushions, we looked through every single fund that we have, every single sub-fund at beginning working capital, and we realized that in 2004, we started debt service for the 2024 bond, and due to, you kind of make a projection of payments based off all the financial factors that in 2004. And interest rates have been much higher, and we were very blessed that this kind of broke our way, and we have $2.9 million, and we finished payment. We reached out to, legal counsel and reached out to other school districts, and everybody said this needs to be, kind of moved into your general fund, which was an unanticipated windfall for us, and we are very excited that we have it, but it won't be happening again. This is the last amount, and it really helped us this year, but I wanted to call that out. We also have another transfer of $600,000 roughly related to a capital bond, a facilities bond that finished some time ago. And we actually reached out to the state and says, do this need to be put towards capital usage? Because there's beginning fund balance there. And they said, well, that could be interest, that could be anything. It actually needs to go to your general fund. So we're transferring that in too. Again, unanticipated $3.6 million. Nothing like that's coming in the future, but it really is helping us this year.
I just want to emphasize how atypical that is. It doesn't usually break your way that direction, and so to have two of those break our direction is really fortuitous.
Yeah, very fortuitous. But we're very grateful for it. And like I said, the entire finance team, Nick, our accounting director, we've all looked at other funds, and there's just nothing else there. So this is kind of the one time that we're going to put into the general fund, and then we'll see where revenue projections go from there. But based on all those assumptions, we're going to start that stacking, and you can see that FY27, that orange amount for other general fund revenues is larger because of that transfer in. So, okay, any other questions? I'm going to move from revenues into expenditures. Are folks good with that? Okay, we'll keep cruising. So 85% of the general fund operations is personnel expenditures. I think we have, do you know our FTE, Nick? About 1,800, 1,700?
Yeah, maybe a shade.
And probably 2,200 people split out over those FTE. We budgeted at this point in time $200.8 million in personnel for fiscal year 27. That's approximately a 5% increase over.
Sorry, Dan, you said that very fast. Say it again, number of FTE.
I'm going to have to look that up, but I think it's in the 17,
wait,
18.
Back up, you just said something, and I missed it.
I think we have in the range of plus or minus 1,700 or 1,800 FTE, but actually that's split out over 2,100, 2,200 people, right? Because not everybody's a 1.0 FTE.
Yeah,
So,
thank you. I needed to repeat, thanks.
And I'll just say this for that. I mean, this number one, this is why we want an ERP. Number two, this is also position control. Number three, there becomes an affiliation once you get towards kind of the end of that, where people are, like you start getting into subs and you start getting into maybe this person coaches but works in the community. And so you wind up with quite a few positions that are at the end of how we calculate who all works for Bend Pine Schools. That gets a little fuzzier the farther you go. And so there's these are our people who work here every day, that show up every day. Some of them work part-time, some of them work full-time. And that's the number that we're kind of trying to track. And when we talk about FTE, we're talking about that's the total number of full-time positions agnostic to how many people are serving in part-time positions in that FTE as well.
Thank you. In the budget for FY '27, it's approximately 5% increase over fiscal year '26, and we can kind of talk about how we got there. First thing is we increased our vacancy savings assumptions, so 3.15%, which is I think one of our larger vacancy assumptions perhaps ever. That happens when you get pretty tight on the budget. You want to make sure that you're really close to accurate. So what that is, say you budget 210 million initially, then you look and see what's your current vacancy rate, how many people are not in filled positions, and then you apply that to the next year, which actually reduces your personnel, right? Because that's savings to 200 million. So step growth applies to about half of our staff on any given year. It equates to a real personnel percentage increase of 2.5 to 2.7%. There are a bunch of different, kind of CBAs that we have. We have classified, we have certified staff. Certified staff have many more steps than our classified staff do, depending on where you are. Our blast staff used to have 3, now I think we have 5. So it is pretty common that while maybe a certified staff member or a classified staff member may have some more steps to go, certainly blast and some other categories, professional, technical, maybe can top out rather quickly. And as you guys know, as we've talked about, our average certified length is 14.36. If you combine that with having a master's, we have some of the highest educated staff too. A lot of these people are not starting at step 1, and so some of them are stepped out.
And one thing to add to that, our certified staff, when you talk about our educators, almost 50% of our staff are capped, if you will. They are pegged on our salary schedule. And so for them, the only increase in pay they can receive is whatever COLA is offered each year. The rest of our staff still have places that they can earn either years of service increases or education attainment service.
And so then that is the other major part. You have the vacancy savings, but then you have the personnel increases with the step, and then you have the COLA. And CBA-wise, when you kind of average out the 2 CBAs of certified and classified, we're sitting at about 3.3% increase in COLA for it's the last fiscal year, so we'll be open to bargaining again next fiscal year with respect next fiscal year after this budget with respect to COLA. We did hold FTE virtually flat in the requested budget. There were some small natural reductions due to decreased elementary enrollment. So those are natural, those aren't cuts. It's just elementary is down another 100, 150 students. So when you take into account our staffing ratios of 1 to 22 or 1 to 26, depending what grade you're in, naturally you're down some there. But also, as you saw in the ADMW, our IEP students, which are our SPED students, and our ELL, our English language learning, continue to increase. And one thing that, I think we implemented in the last year was starting to do staffing plans related to number of students on SPED and ELL. And so that was one of the major changes that we made budgetarily. And because they are now on staffing plans as well, when they have an increase in students, they have an increase in FTE. So those two things kind of even themselves out, as at least they did as of when I wrote this. As of today, we actually look back at elementary enrollment, and there probably is going to be a net reduction of about 5.5 FTE across the budget. So we do know we will need to significantly reduce personnel costs from the 200.8 million in this budget cycle, and are working on those models currently. Probably every day or every other day I'm talking with Dr. Cook. After this meeting, we'll talk about it, about different kind of reduction strategies. It should also be said that insurance cap increases approximately 4% across all bargaining groups. There's some minor PERS increases every time that your personnel just increases. So any questions related to personnel? Again, it's 85% of our expenditures, so it's our main lever when you talk about cost reduction, and it's also just really important to understand kind of the mechanics of those budgetary estimates.
Can I add one thing? One thing to keep in mind that we participate in, many districts in the state of Oregon do, but is not necessarily typical. Ben Lapine Schools picks up the employees' portion of their PERS contribution. And so when you talk about overall costs for personnel, that 6% pickup that we provide for our staff, which our staff, I tell you, they're very appreciative of that. It's equivalent of a little more than a 6% raise. That is a cost that the district is eating, that the district is not necessarily receiving additional funding for. It is a perk, it's a raise, however you want to think about it. And I'm not suggesting that we should do anything to undo that, but it is a cost. And so when you think about that over 1,500 to 2,000 employees that might be participating in benefits in the district, it is a real cost.
Superintendent Cook, do other school districts cover that cost for their employees routinely in Oregon?
In Oregon, most do, but not all. And the nearest district that I'm aware of that does not is Redmond. But I think most of the other districts in Central Oregon do pick it up.
So that was the budget, and now we're going to talk about the long-term forecast looking forward. So further out past fiscal year 27, we kind of maintain the current vacancy rate of 3.15. The year-over-year personnel increase is 8.25%. And the reason for that is mostly that there's this large PERS increase that we know is coming in fiscal year 28. In fiscal year 28, the PERS rates are right now projected to increase by 7 percentage points. And it's actually 8 percentage points, I think, if you include the 1 percentage point of rate relief that we built into long-term forecasts. So we have that built in. But, we spent a lot of time talking with Piper Sandler and with the state, and they believe that those actuarial assessments are tight. So they don't believe that they're going to vary too much at this point in time. So we will be looking at least a 7% increase. And that is an additional $9 million over, what you would anticipate in your normal PERS. So it's a real hit that's coming in 28. It's part of the reason why you have to do a long-term forecast like this. It's not good enough just to balance your 5% reserve, because in 1 year you could have a $9 million hit like this. And so going forward, for the most part, it's 2.7% steps or in and around that range, and it's a general range for the COLA, but it's also the PERS rates that are really bumping us up to a large percent there.
Is this slide assume that our number of personnel stays flat? Like what's the?
Correct. This slide would assume, so the base, when we stack all these graphs, we're going to stack the revenue, and then we're going to stack the expenditures based off everything kind of staying flat without cuts, and then we'll see what the gap is, and maybe briefly talk about general financial solutions and some of the models that we're showing for that.
But just to be clear one more time, like on the prior slide, you're saying that the FTEs are holding virtually flat but then we're also sort of admitting that we're losing 100 kids a year or more, right?
Correct.
Okay, so staffing is staying the same, even as the number of kids are going down every single year.
I think for the point of this presentation, to show the long-term forecast as what would happen, to show you what would happen if the district didn't come in and make changes, correct. But when we're talking about the proposed budget, I will be honest, the proposed budget, we're not going to land at $200.8 million in personnel, and we'll talk about that some more. But in order to close the gap, I think the easiest thing is to show the gap first and then show why we have to close the gap. And so that's kind of what we're doing here, but we're not anticipating that personnel will be at 200.8 when we meet in a month from now. Does that answer your question, Director Lynch? Okay. And that's also a good question, because I'll just say this ahead of time. When you look out here at flat FTE, if you cut $1 million in this year in 27, by the time you hit FY29, 3 years later, with all the personnel increases, that's about $3.2 million. So Director Lynch has a good point. Obviously, we couldn't and we can't do flat FTE, and we're going to have to make some reductions. But just to know that those personnel reductions stack year over year, plus there's COLAs and things like that. So, okay. General fund expenditures, utilities, and purchase service budgets, 2.2% increase from FY26 budget. Major expenditures include our charter school payment. We pass through the ADMW, or a percentage of the ADMW. Substitutes, utilities, maintenance. We are holding $1.1 million for the ERP next year. It will likely potentially be more than that. So this is a very tight budget. $22.8 million right now. You can see that again up at the top line there. Many line items have been cut over the last 2 years. You know, the long-term forecast is a 3.5% year-over-year increase, which is, you know, similar to the consumer price index. That's pretty conservative. I will say that this is another line item that you will see a reduction in. Just talk generally about our budget process without getting too much into it, because we're right there right now. But we look at our ending fund balance, right, and then we say, well, we need to make reductions, and the first thing we try to reduce is line items like this, right? We try to reduce supplies, we try to reduce utilities, we try to do common sense things to cut. I will tell you right now that we've cut over over $1 million in these line items, so this number will be smaller. And then you kind of get into personnel, but it's very tight. You know, we'll probably talk about this at the proposed budget too, but Dr. Cook, myself, Paul Dean, who's our COO, and Lisa Burke, we all met, and we said, is there any fluff in this budget? And I gave them a list of things, and unfortunately for us, there wasn't a lot of fluff. The things that we ended up cutting are softwares that we've used for, you know, multiple years, where we continue to defer maintenance and get rid of equipment. There were some tough discussions, and I don't want to, you know, kind of unfold all of that before the proposed budget, but I do want people to know that this number is less, just to balance the budget.
Can you talk a little bit about the difference between the line items 121 and 122, a couple slides back, that are subs, and the $4 million plus on this slide that are subs? ESD subs. So like 121 licensed substitutes, those are teachers, right? $996,000.
Sure. So basically the difference, the object codes that start with 01, it's a salary. The object codes that start with an 03, it's a professional service, so it's a service that we are purchasing. The 0122 and 0121, those are our employees that we are paying that work for us either in a substitute capacity, or we are paying them to fill in for a class. So the most common one in 0121 would be a teacher is out sick, and so another teacher is filling that class and they're working on their prep period, and so they get paid for that service. So that would be kind of like a 0121. Then in 0122, we have a couple of departments that provide their own subs because they're really hard to do. The biggest one is transportation. How do you get a substitute bus driver when somebody calls out sick? So we actually have a stable of substitute bus drivers that are our employees and that they're on call to do that sort of stuff. Another department that has a stable of subs is our custodial department, same kind of thing. You know, how do you train somebody to do all this stuff? So again, those are in the 0121 and 0122, those are our employees that are performing a substitute service. And then the 0315 and 0316, we subcontract with the ESD to provide our subs. And so those are going to be teachers out for a day, and we have a substitute employee that is actually an employee of the ESD, but they are coming into our classroom to perform a service for that day. So that's basically the difference, is who is it that we're paying for that service? Directly our employee, or is it that we are paying the ESD for them to provide a contract?
So when one of our certified instructors picks up a period or two, in addition, that's on top, we give them money on top of their salary to pick up those shifts. And then, and I was in a high desert ESD sub, so I do know that we get paid. Is there anything that expresses those in terms of days?
There isn't, actually.
I mean, what does $4 million mean in terms of like missing teacher days? Like, is that like every teacher was gone for one day and so we spent $4 million? Or like what, I just want to know what that means in terms of days.
That's a good question. I don't think we have any metrics related to, I mean, we're already struggling to have metrics related to vacancy due to not having the ERP. So even just to compare it to the
Couldn't we-
denominator of
High
vacancy.
Desert ESD, like, couldn't you put that on them? Like,
We
if
could.
we paid them $4 million. Like, do
we
they not
know?
know how many days they worked?
Do
Let's
we know
ask
if
them.
Red Rover, yeah,
Yeah,
I mean, I think,
yeah.
I think that we could probably get that information, and I want to say it's about $250 a day for a certified sub. So I can't do that math in my head, but that
It's
would,
a lot of days.
yeah, it is,
Yeah.
for sure. And, you know, when you think about it, we have contracts with our teachers, and that there is, you know, contractually specified leaves and things like that, and sick days and all the other things, and so
Professional development.
that is really what that substitute employee cost 0315 and
Yeah, I
0316
just
is
found
to
that out.
cover.
So Dan, do you basically project those costs from past years? Because you don't know how many days you're gonna need subs until you need them, right? So
Correct.
you just go on what percentages usually you did in the past?
Mm-hmm. And we can break it down by location and things like that, but breaking it further down to days, we can't do. We can look at historical actual trends. But we can definitely request for the by days. But correct, we look at it kind of at the historical actual level by location and piece it all together to come up with that number.
Isn't the hope that the HRS system eventually will be able to do all that tracking in terms of employees?
The HRS system at minimum should be able to do the tracking of vacant positions, but just because somebody's out a day doesn't mean that they're vacant per se.
Okay.
I think in order to get this information, that probably wouldn't be a standard feature of an HRS system, but in order to get this information, we should be able to reach out to High Desert ESD and
Okay.
get an idea.
Your dream ERP won't have time and attendance?
I think it would, I mean, it would have time and attendance, but yeah, it would have time and attendance. I don't know, but the way we pay people is, you know, they're spread pay. So there's only some people that are actually positive pay punchers, and we could pull that right now, but those are our bus workers and nutrition. So
Is 311 the instructional services? Is that like driver's ed? Like, what's in there?
It is, I think it's primarily kind of like teacher and instructional training programs. So I don't think it has actual curriculum in it, but more so, you know, resources for teachers and things along those lines.
So who are we paying that to? Our teachers or somebody else, some other vendor?
Yeah,
Other vendors?
professional service.
yeah, we could come up with a vendor list for you, but there's a hodgepodge of vendors for consulting and for professional services across the district.
And, okay, presumably that's things we can't do ourselves. These are skills we do not have as a employee cohort.
Presumably.
I'm not sure it would be necessarily skills we don't have, whether or not we have time as a resource to be able to deliver those.
I mean, so we'd have to look, but my guess is that things like Youth Truth and about 30,000 other things are in here, and so.
If it's really 50,000, that's a lot, but if
No,
it's,
no.
if it's like 100, I think I'd be interested.
Yeah. Any other questions related to these slides? Mhm. Okay, so personnel, utilities, expenditures, when you stack them on top, that's where we are. And we're gonna cruise through that. Get to the supplies budget. It's a little bit of a smaller budget than the utilities and services budget. It's only 8.8 million. It's a 9% increase, 733K from fiscal year '26. The main reason for that is we're holding $1.1 million in the ERP. So absent the ERP, we actually cut somewhere around 400,000 out of supplies and computer hardware. And we've made an additional cut since this was done a few days ago. And many line items have been cut over the last 2 years as well. We have to remember that last year, I think we cut at least a couple million out of operations, largely from maintenance department and things like that. So this is this is the second, third year of operational cuts, which is why we're getting a little tight on some of these things. The long-term forecast does have a 3.5% aligned with the consumer price index increase, and it could very well be greater than 3.5%. These hold our computer costs, not digital curriculum, that's in 145, but this does hold our software costs that we use throughout the district. And those prices are not beholden to the CPI. So they're increasing steadily. A lot of people are going from from general district-wide models to subscription license models, which are costing us more. So 3.5% is very conservative for this. Questions?
More of a comment, just I would love to see kind of a financial breakdown, not here, not right now, obviously, of the cost of de-teching some of our curriculum and what that would cost. I'm just curious with how much we spend on electronic devices, curriculum, if that investment is necessarily worth what we're getting out of it in terms of student achievement. And I think our community wants those questions. And so I would love to see an answer to that sometimes, what the cost would be if we were to reduce our tech use. Would that actually cost us money or would that save us money?
Yeah, I think we can certainly work on that too. So here's another slide, stacking them on top of each other with the supplies. We're going to kind of get to our last expenditures here, and I'm cognizant of time, and we're probably only halfway through, so I want to kind of cruise through this. This expenditure category is debt payments, liability insurance, and equipment expense. You can see that it's $15.3 million. The larger debt payment is $10.4 million for the per site accounts. That's going to expire, going into fiscal year 28, we'll have about a $4 million hit, and then fiscal year 29, we won't have that payment. However, while that's a reduction, that's a savings in debt service. Unfortunately, that's the same years where the PERS hit's going to come in. So they more than offset each other, where the PERS is going to offset that. In the long-term forecast, the debt payments are accounted for in future years. Liability insurance is increasing at 15% in fiscal year 28 and then 7% over the next few years. It should be noted that the last 2 years, liability insurance has increased, 22% or more. And we're involved in some things there. So we do know that liability rates will continue to increase right now. So now we've stacked those expenditures. Last but not least, when we talk about expenditures, and this is a really important concept to understand, is transfers out, right? So historically, general fund operations transfers revenues out to other funds to subsidize their costs, legally balance their budgets, or in some cases build reserves. That's why they're often called the reserve funds for critical future years operations purchases within the general fund subfunds. And so the general fund subfunds, some people use reserves. In general fund subfunds, they're interchangeable. I think they probably got the word reserves because for a good 6-7 years, we were, our fund balance was increasing, and we were transferring that into these subfunds, which are like deferred maintenance funds and things like that, IT funds. And so they were holding a lot of that capital. I came in a year and a half ago and said we're no longer doing that transfer, also because we started almost eating into beginning working capital, and it just wasn't fiscally responsible, and we've been burning through the beginning working capital very quickly at this point in time. But typically we've been sending money that way, and now we're gonna have to send money that way to balance those funds. In governmental accounting, we do have funds, they're separate entities. We move dollars from one fund to another. The fund which sends the dollars is doing the transfer out. The fund that's receiving is doing a transfer in. It's very similar to when you transfer funds between two bank accounts. If you have $100 in your checking account and you want to send $10 from your checking to your savings account, you transfer out $10 from your checking and you transfer it into your savings, right? And now your checking is 90 and savings is 10. And so that's what we're doing a lot of times with these sub-funds. We transfer these from resources to cover the expenditures. The current budget for transfers out of the general fund is $9.7 million. It's a 21% increase over fiscal year 26 because critical funds like curriculum and athletics have depleted their fund balance and now need close to 100% transfer support. So a few years back, curriculum had, $5 million, I believe, and we'll find out if that's the correct number when we go through that slide, in beginning fund balance. And now they have nothing, right? And so you can imagine we were just transferring $1.5 million, kind of keeping that fund balance at $5 million. And now we're transferring $5-6 million to cover the entire cost. And so it's really hitting us. It's pretty critical. Because we are in a financially difficult position, we are only budgeting to transfer out general fund revenues to balance budgets. So if a sub-fund is deficient, we're only doing transfers that way. Because of this, because we're not building any fund balance or reserves, all the sub-fund reserve levels that are left will continue to drop rapidly in fiscal year '27 as funds that maintain transfer revenue and had reserves will have to spend them down to cover expenditures. So just understanding these transfers is really, really critical. Nick's going to guide us through these sub-fund reserves and kind of the misconception and what they're used for. And we'll kind of analyze those in detail so you can see what those transfers are used for. It's something that certainly in the past, a lot of people around the school district have said, well, what's in that fund? What's in that fund? That can't be used. And so it's really important that we shed some light and some financial transparency on what is on those funds.
And I get athletics having its own fund because it presumably generates revenue-ish, but like, I don't understand curriculum. Why does it have its own
Fund.
fund?
Yeah, I mean,
It's not
I
the general
think-
fund.
I mean, this general ledger was set up way before my time. I think it's debatable on if you need a fund for this or if you could use line items based on location. At this point in time, changing the GL is something that we will likely do when we go out for the ERP. Yeah, yeah, but it is nice. I'll leave it at that. When we go out for an ERP, we will probably have to change the GL, and that'll be a good question. Yeah.
All right, so we have, I think, 9 general fund sub-funds, and they kind of all support different programs throughout the district. So we'll kind of go through those pretty quickly. We'll talk about each one for sure. If you have any questions, please jump in and stop us so that we can cover all those. Broadly speaking, our general fund sub-funds have a beginning fund balance combined of about $9.5 million. So they make up about 30% of the general fund in total in terms of beginning fund balance. The flip side is that in the last, from this year to next year, budget-wise, it's a reduction of $2.7 million. So point being that we are consuming fund balance in those sub-funds, and that the overall kind of picture is that as our fund balance in the sub-funds disappears, then it means that the draw on the general fund to support them increases. So that's really kind of why we're talking about these, is because we have all these specific things that these sub-funds do, and that we have to find a way to fund them because they don't fund themselves. So first fund is the athletics fund in 120. And this is basically the school's portion of athletics. So it has money for equipment and supplies and transportation of students to sporting events and things along those lines. Does also pay for some minimal staff things, referees for some of our sporting events and that sort of thing. Let's see, it is starting with a beginning fund balance of $286,000, and it has a transfer of, sorry, I don't have my glasses on, looks like $878,000 from the general fund. And the other part of this fund is that we have pay-to-play fees for students, and we charge admission to sporting events and things along those lines. So all of that revenue goes into Fund 120 and helps offset the transfer to the general fund. At this point, kind of when you look at it, the total expenses compared to what our fund balance is, it's kind of a single-year fund.
So what is 410? What's in there?
Object code 410 is supplies. So that's going to be in football, helmets and tackling dummies and things along those lines, uniforms, that sort of thing. So in essence, actual supplies for our sporting events and teams.
We don't buy tackling dummies every year, but yeah.
Correct. But baseballs, basketballs, bats, that sort of thing, it is, there's a lot.
I would, I would say that, you know, having Gabe as an athletic director now, this is our first year really digging into this and saying, hey, Gabe, like, we need you to look into what are the athletic directors spending money on in supplies without us going through 70,000 invoice lines. But I will say that we're holding this budget flat, you know. In past years, we've increased it. We held it flat last year too. And I can't always tell you exactly what's in supplies, but I can tell you coaches are saying there's certainly not enough. And we hear that every
But-
day,
and-
so.
And again, like, just to be, like, it matches in you have to move, like, it's almost exactly the same amount of money that you have to subsidize it to the tune of, yeah,
Totally.
okay.
Yeah.
All right, the next fund, 121, is essentially the district portion of the athletics program. And so the district pays for all of our coaching staff. So the primary expense here is coaches' salaries. And again, kind of like the Fund 120, this really isn't a reserve fund. It's pretty much a single year kind of program, and that we are transferring dollars from the general fund to cover these expenses. And, you know, I mean, this is truly operational. We have, I can't remember what the coaching FTE is, you know, probably about 800. And we have 800 coaches, and their salaries are kind of rolling through this, plus any of the other district-related things, you know, athletics trainers and things along those lines that go in there. So, I mean, it's a really important part of our program. And again, it's, in essence, it's a single-year fund where it is drawing on the general fund to do these things. We have a fund balance projected of $57,000, and then a transfer of $4.5 million in from the general fund to support it. And then when you combine 120 and 121, you're looking at about $5.5 million almost of transfers in to cover these programs.
And we'll just add a little bit of maybe a deeper level of things there. So this district is obviously pretty heavily invested in athletics to some degree with that number. And also, when you look at our year-over-year capture rates and our enrollment rates, when you go from 8th grade to 9th grade, you start seeing that jump like 111%, 114%. And so we do think, while at first you can be like, okay, this is all cost to the district, and certainly that's somewhat, you know, that's debatable. We're pretty sure that when people are jumping out of private schools and coming, or charter schools, and they're coming here, part of that reason is because they are in athletics. And when you see that one big bump, it's hard to know exactly what percentage there is, but there's something there too.
So I'm going to just redact my statement earlier that I understand why this is its own, I don't understand at all why this isn't just part of the general fund or part of I'm like, what is here that couldn't be replicated in the?
I'm not sure if
There's no good answer to that, except this is what we both inherited.
And I want to, that's probably the case. And also, a lot of our general ledger and fund structure is defined by the project budget and counting manual by the state. And sometimes I look at that and I say, I don't know why that's there, but it is a definition that we have. I don't know if the athletics funds are a requirement, but if they're not, then I side with Dr. Cook that we could probably put athletics line items related to those in different locations.
And remember, PBAM will be coming in the next 2 years, and when PBAM is the requirement by the state to change the general ledger structure so that they can track how we're spending by account codes. And so I would imagine that this will be changed dramatically when that happens.
And this is probably the number one thing that CFOs and business managers are kind of worked up around the state about. The PBAM right now has about what we call 4 keys. So you have fund, function, location, object, and the initial PBAM that they wanted was 11 keys. So when you talk about going to a higher level of generalization, that is the opposite way that they are, that the state is going. They're going towards keys for performance metrics, keys for everything. So
So,
Another unfunded mandate.
yeah, administrator salary's pretty high. Is that just athletic directors, or who all's included in the administrator salaries?
correct.
Yeah,
Correct, that's the athletic directors, and then Gabe Pagano, who's the director of the athletics director, would be in there as well. And, you know, if you were to look at this a year ago, they weren't in administration positions, so you would have seen them in a different line item, but currently, they're there.
Let me clarify what he's talking about. Well, last year, we decided as a district that we were going to require all of our athletic directors to also be administrative personnel. In our district, we allowed and actually quite frankly supported the idea of certified staff, effectively teachers, being able to serve as the athletic directors for their respective high schools. And one of the challenges we ran in with that is that a certified member can't evaluate a certified member. And so when you would have an athletic director could not evaluate coaching performance. And so we believed that was, well, we didn't believe, we decided that was not okay and that we wanted to change that structure. And so now our athletic directors are administrative staff. And that requirement I think we bargained that with the certified union to move every one of those staff members that either had administrative services or gave them an amount of time to get their administrative license.
Okay, any other questions on athletics before we? Okay, the next one is instructional materials. And this is pretty much where we buy all of our curriculum from. And again, it's not really a reserve fund. I think so far this year, we've got about $5.1 million in expenses there. This really doesn't have much of a fund balance either. So again, we're on the idea of kind of a single year sort of fund. This one, again, doesn't really have any fund balance, so to speak of, doesn't have any revenues to support it. It is just a place where we are kind of setting aside all of our curriculum purchases into a single spot. Transfer from the general fund is looking to be $5 million. And the expectation is with all the kind of curriculum requirements and things along those lines coming down from the state, that this is something that is going to continue to grow year over year. And so we're expecting it to be, in essence, an increasing load on the general fund.
Just to preface this next slide, I mean, most of these slides are going to be one slide for the reserve fund, but because of the instructional materials curriculum has gone up so much, we wanted you to have a look into that.
Yeah, this is really hard to see, and honestly, it's hard for me to read on the piece of paper without my glasses, but I believe that in 2020, our Fund 145 expenses were 1.8, and in 2026, we're looking at almost 5.1. So this is a really significant increase over time. That's kind of why we wanted to show this. This is not, like, oh, we're, socking money away for all these sorts of things. These are what our expenses are, and it is increasing at a pretty significant rate.
And a lot of this is because, well, it's twofold, right? I mean, the district's made a lot of state mandated adoptions, and there's this shift to digital curriculum, and digital curriculum is just more expensive. I think the reason that I put this slide in is I've sat here and listened to several kind of curriculum conversations, and I think going forward, it'd be nice to have some comparison of prices too as we start looking at state mandated curriculums, because frankly, this is something when I came in last year into this position, I kind of looked and said, okay, we were at 2 million, now we're at 3 million. And then my long-term forecast had like 3.5 million and 3.75. And that's just not the way it works. We spent a lot of time working with Dr. Burke and her curriculum team, and we do have some state mandated things that we need to do. And this digital curriculum that we have bought and purchased now is very costly. And so without going back on that, these are costs that we're stuck with, and we have more curriculum that we need to go forward, so.
I think it's important to know too, that as a reminder, our adoption cycle from the state has been every 7 years. And so that really, we've done all of our biggest adoptions, language arts and mathematics tend to be our biggest adoptions in the past 3 years. So this year, language arts, is employed, although we've been, the adoption began last year. And then, I'm sorry, math. And then prior to that was 2 years of language arts. So these big chunks of big curriculum purchases are also not something that's even reflected in the past 5 years. Like that time when that occurred would have been like at 18, 17, 18, that time frame. So these are big purchases across the state. It's also important to know that the state recognizes that from both an expenditure standpoint and like learning something and implementing it well, they're looking at extending this 7-year cycle so that we aren't doing things every 7 years, but also thinking about how can we not have math and language arts back to back, knowing that they're really big, impactful pieces and that we spread those out. So that's something that we'll just be managing in the years to come.
Yeah. And I think the kind of thing that was interesting is we met with Lisa's team multiple times and we forecasted out the next 5 years. And even though those are one-time expenditures, just the cost of the digital curriculum alone keeps those expenditures pretty much at that 5 million and slowly growing. But I did want to just, shout out to Dr. Burke's team that we saw this. We made a vendor list of every single software we have. What can we get rid of? What can we not? And we've made, going into the proposed budget, we've made some tentative changes there to things that are, non-state mandated. So.
Yeah, one other thing that I'll just add instructional material wise is that the state now mandates like social emotional standards related to social emotional wellness. And so we adopted 4 years ago now a K-12 curriculum for social emotional learning called Wayfinder. And so that is something that for Ben Lapine has never occurred, and that is a K-12 adoption, which is the only K-12 adoption really that we have in that same manner.
So again, in that 410 supplies line item, we have just a mystery $1 million this year. What is that?
In a lot of cases, they're supplementary things. So like we have a science curriculum adoption going on right now, and that it comes with all of these lab supplies. And so one of the labs, my wife is a science teacher and using this, so we have the books on top of the coffee table and all that kind of stuff. One of the labs, I think you make volcanoes. And so there are all kinds of supplies, you use it, and then the next time you go to do that lab, you have to go buy new things. And then I think there's also, what would be the right way to put it? Various different sorts of, not add-on things, I guess, but what's that? Manipulatives? Yeah, exactly. That's the term, manipulatives. Various different things that we are using as a part of the lesson. It's not a workbook itself. It's not some printed piece of paper. It is, some sort of thing or some sort of supply that goes along with the lesson.
Yeah. And we spent multiple times digging into, the supply line, and that was, there's $50,000 cost for math manipulatives, and chemistry supplies were, 6-figure cost, and they get used, and then you have to buy them again next year. Now this supply line is a little high. This is the line that is like a little high for 1 year. It'll go back down next year because we will have all those labs, but we will have to pay for chemistry, physics. But just so people know, when you look at the curriculum, the digital curriculum, we actually, we amortize that over like 6 years, the life of the curriculum, right? So it's split. So those costs are going to remain the same, but we might have a little bit of a decreased cost in supplies next year.
With the advent of AI, do you anticipate any of the software costs or digital content costs going down over time? I mean, probably more pertaining to the long-term forecast than what we're seeing in this into 26.
Yeah, that's a minefield. I think just from if you're living in just common sense land, that makes a lot of sense that as that one would go up, another would go down. That's not how it's playing out. Costs remain high for hardback things and for digital content. And so I don't know. The answer has been so far no. That's not what we're seeing. But it also is important to know that we've been able to recognize, as Dan said, our team has taken a look at like, what are the things that we have adopted and had in place for a couple of years that we know this actually is not, although it was maybe like part of an adoption or sort of part of the thing, it's not sort of a return on investment that we're willing to, kind of dive into. And so we're recognizing that sometimes that's unique to content areas and sometimes that's unique to grade levels too. So like for our earliest grades, there may be things that we are not a good return on investment from a digital standpoint. And there may be some content areas that it's like, oh, this really isn't helpful. Whereas others are living in a really different spot.
And I will just say, like, that's the same exact conversation that I had with Dr. Burke last night. And as we were looking at vendors, we had several different AI type vendors. And I said, what's the overlap here? Where's the Venn diagram? And I'll be honest, like the AI is moving so quickly that that Venn diagram is changing, and we haven't done, we need to do kind of a full analysis of that. Because on the base of it, here's a good example. On the base of it, we're going to have some one AI product that can do something similar to what a curriculum AI product can do. And I said, Dr. Burke, can we cut this? And so we called in, our curriculum team, and they said, actually, no, because the more generic AI program, when they synthesize the news articles and then make it at a 3rd grade, 4th grade reading, they don't always do it. Sometimes they're not 3rd and 4th grade appropriate still. Like in a lot of the specific class AI that we've purchased has a lot of built-in generative kind of technology that makes sure that something like that can't happen. And so there's still some risk with, getting rid of something if the requirements aren't met. And so that was interesting for me to hear that, because I hadn't thought about that. I was like, why can't we just use this AI? It's way cheaper. But that AI doesn't cater towards 10-year-olds yet.
As we're looking into our digital tool bank too, one of the things that we're noticing is that like any company, any of these companies are really savvy in terms of their pricing structure. And so, many of them are built, at least initially, at a school level. And so if you have your 33 schools have access to those, that's one thing. But then when you're actually looking at usage, you have maybe half, of your actual users using it, again, based on content, based on grade level, those types of things. And so it would make sense that we would just say, oh, well, we'll get half as many licenses. Well, you can't if they're at the school level. And so we're trying to work with our vendors also to say, okay, we actually do need to recreate our contracts so that it's supporting like the unique needs of the instruction that's necessary. But not sort of a blanket thing for everybody, because just cost, as you can see, we don't have areas where we can just be frivolous with our costs. So we really need to be really thoughtful, but that's going to take us doing some renegotiations and some curation of some of the things that we have.
And I'm very, that would be great if AI changes the long-term forecast and can reduce our software costs, yeah.
Yeah, I think so. And just bullish on it driving down software costs just across the board.
Makes sense.
I think, and I just to piggyback on your question, I think the real question is not that software, it's the $3 million in vector and exchange and your ERP and, like that's the trend is going to be like those start to, in 3 years, you code us a new ERP. And it sounds crazy, but it's actually probably more like 1 year. I know it sounds crazy. You like out in the world, that is what's happening.
Yeah, certainly, and we talked about should we do something internally with the ERP software. I think the thing is like in terms of giving access to on-prem data to AI is still probably the sticky. Yeah, that's the stickiest part right now. Yeah, with student data.
All right, our next subfund is the Transportation Reserve. And this is basically where we hold funds to pay for bus purchases. And kind of the general idea was that we have a fleet replacement plan to make sure that our fleet of buses is stable, safe, and reasonably good condition, all that kind of stuff. And I think that the plan called for essentially $1 to $2 million in purchases per year. And the goal was to have, a couple years worth of purchases available. And, right now we're kind of down to about a year is really where we are. And the funding source for this fund, we have, some interest and things along those lines. And then we also get a transportation depreciation reimbursement from the state. So that's that object code 3222, that essentially $1.1 million. So that's basically where that kind of comes from. And again, with inflationary costs of buses, the cost of buses has gone up significantly in the last couple of years. So
What's
it's,
a ballpark?
$1
million bucks?
It depends on the bus, but they used to be about 130 and now they're about 200.
Oh, okay.
So
And the electric ones, the new buses, the diesel ones, they're not really paying out, right?
yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty hard to get diesel buses now. The electric ones, we've got one and it was, did not go over very well, put it that way. And then I think a big portion of our buses are propane.
And I will say, when we look at like the useful life, and I would say our transportation department's a big fan of the diesel ones in terms of they are just longevity wise do much better in terms of repairs as well. So,
And if we want to stay on track, 6 buses a year is what it takes. And we have, what, about 125 buses right now, something like that?
Sounds about
Yeah.
right. We have a big fleet. So generally speaking, this is a fund that is somewhat self-funded from the state. But again, we are essentially consuming resources and at some point may get to the point where we're subsidizing it with a general fund in order to be able to maintain our fleet the way we want. The next one, Fund 165, is our print shop fund. So we have a print shop that provides printing services to the district and also various people throughout the community. This one is basically a self-sustaining one because it's funded on the cost of printing services. And again, like all the other ones we've had before, it's not really a reserve fund. This is an actual operating print shop, and that we have kind of all of the finances set aside just for that purpose. And that in the event that we do actually start to accumulate some fund balance, we do what we call a print shop rebate. So basically all the schools that are using the print shop to print their course materials and all that kind of stuff, we give them a rebate into their discretionary accounts to essentially return the excess printing costs back to the schools so that there's a little extra revenue there. Any questions on print shop?
And just a reminder, those discretionary funds come from the general fund. So they're just getting back those dollars that we originally gave to them and that they could use on the print shop.
The next one is our facility usage fund. This is basically the school's portion of facility usage. So a member of the community wants to rent out an auditorium to put on a play, then we've got kind of part of the revenue goes back to the site, and then part of the revenue goes to maintenance to kind of do all the other things with it. So that's kind of the primary funding source of this one. There's also some other little quirky budgets in there, furniture replacement and some CTE resources. This one is basically funded by those community dollars, so it's not funded by any kind of general fund reserves or anything along those lines. And at this point, it's got a fund balance of about $517,000. And so it's just kind of money available for schools. Mostly it goes into small purchases of furniture and repairs to their facilities and things along those lines. Do you have the clicker?
oh yeah, you already clicked.
Oh, okay. Fund 171 is the next fund, and it's the Facilities Project Fund. And so in our facility usage kind of rental fees, about 25% of it goes to the school. This is where the 75% balance goes. And so it is essentially a small reserve fund. We've got a little bit of staff salaries in there to take care of our buildings after we have public events there. That's kind of what the staff salaries are there for. And then the remainder of it is there basically as a mini reserve for small projects that maintenance may need to do throughout the district. The next one is Fund 175. It's our technology replacement. This one has basically our budget for all of our tech infrastructure. So all of our big purchases, this is where they come from. In the past, we had a reasonable revenue source for it. The program is called E-rate, and so the federal government reimburses us on some percentage for providing internet connectivity. And so there, in the past, has been some revenue in there. We're anticipating it to go down. That's that $316,000 in revenue. Used to be about a 50% reimbursement, but it's going to be significantly less than that. But these are really significant expenses. And so we have kind of a higher than you would think fund balance because we're anticipating to spend roughly 3/4 of it in the next 2 years, between this year and next year. So there's a lot that's going in there. And that we are not providing any transfers out of the general fund to cover this for now. So we may get to the point in the very near future where this is something that we're going to have to subsidize with the general fund as well. Any questions on that one? The Fund 180 is our maintenance replacement fund, and this really kind of is a reserve. It's the place where we would pay for projects that aren't covered by our capital projects or our bond dollars. And then also if there are maintenance things that need to be covered that we don't have the budget for in our regular maintenance department, this is where they would come from. So you think about, we've got 33 schools and who knows how many other facilities, and some of them are significantly aged, and what the cost would be if we had to replace HVAC systems or things along those lines is pretty significant. So at the end of the day, this is a pretty small reserve for what the potential cost could be, considering how many buildings we have and students and all that good stuff.
Yeah, realistically, this reserve kind of concerns me. 1.3 million is about how much, an HVAC failure would cost. And we'd have to just move that into our capital bond and move out a project, frankly. And so something want to get done at High Lakes or another school, two of those 89 projects want to get done. But this is a very small, deferred maintenance reserve.
And I just want to remind folks that the state mandated that we replace all fluorescent light bulbs and extended the number of years for us to be able to do that. And we estimate that cost right now to be upwards of $20 million to replace it with high efficiency LED bulbs. And so
It's 10% of our budget.
And they funded nothing.
All right, our last one, Fund 190 is our insurance reserve. So this kind of has the liability and judgment costs. It's kind of where we plan to pay for those, along with supplies and repairs and things along those lines that go with insurance compliance, basically. This typically doesn't receive a transfer from the general fund. Seems like it's been doing okay based on the insurance reimbursements and things like that that we are getting that are going in to fund this fund. So right now we've got an ending balance of about 2.1 million, and that we also are planning a transfer of $625,000 out of this fund to support other operations. All right, so kind of essentially a recap. These sub-funds really aren't reserve funds. They're not hidden pockets of money. These are really more I wouldn't say drain, but they are being funded by the general fund rather than the other way around. So it's really the general fund is looking at these as these are really critical components of what we're doing, and they impact student outcomes, and that we have to cover them. So that's kind of what they are. Again, we've got curriculum, athletics, internet connectivity, which is particularly important in, when we're talking about digital curriculum, cybersecurity, which is a huge thing, transportation, we've got critical maintenance for our district facilities, safety, legal coverage. These are all really pretty important things. And as Dan mentioned earlier, we really aren't funding any of these funds, programs, activities with general fund dollars other than what is minimally necessary. So that's kind of where we are. Big picture, you can see what we are projecting in the long term, which is a pretty significant increase in the transfers out of the general fund to all these sub-funds to maintain kind of all these programs and services. And so that's really, when you think about the sub-funds, you've got all of these things that we are doing that are important, and then this is what the impact is. In order to sustain that, we're looking at, almost a $5 million increase over the next 4 years.
Yeah, and we forecast out each one of these sub-funds for the next 5 years. And when you look at FY29 right there, what's happening is that tech fund that does all of equipment, that's being depleted, right? So, or getting close to being depleted, so it needs a larger transfer. Because it's, again, as Director Lynch said, most of this could probably be general fund if it's not in the PBAM specifically. Those are expenditures we have to make, and we anticipate kind of the next maybe larger adoption of curriculum to be there, and that could have a cost to it as well. So that's kind of why you see that big bump, and then that bump would be maintained for a couple years. Are there any questions related to sub-funds or transfers out before we head kind of back to general fund operations? Okay. We have about 15 slides and about 30 minutes, so I'll go as fast as possible, and they're important slides. So, that whole thing was kind of a segue to talk about what those funds are and why we make those transfers out, because those are real expenditures. The general fund, those are the last real expenditures. We stack them on top of, kind of all of our financial forecasting that we've done before, and you get an idea of what those expenditures are out for the next 4 years. And then we come to our reserves. So, now that we've kind of walked you through our revenues and reserves, you subtract all your expenditures from all your revenues, and that leaves us with the district fund balance. Like I said, 6-7 years ago, every year, revenues were greater than expenditures, and we put $3-4 million into those funds, into athletics, into curriculum, and we built a fund balance that we've now spent through. That's the opposite. Expenditures are over revenues, and it's a pretty simple process. I think I put a little thing in here, if you make $50K a year and your expenditures are $40K, then you roll over the next year with $10,000, right? But the district does, the same process on a much larger scale, and we kind of call the start that the amount that we carry over in the next fiscal year, the beginning fund balance, right? And so a table of historical beginning funding balance of the general fund, including the sub-funds, along with fiscal year 27 budget estimate is shown below. You can see, or you may not be able to see, but in 21 we had about 24 million, and then we went up in 22 to almost 30 million. We had a slight dip, probably due to ESSER, and then up to 33, 40, and then we're up by 500,000, and we're projecting, I think our new projection is probably somewhere around 33 for the 27 budget. And I did have our accounting director kind of go through our cash flows and look at where we were last time this year. And yeah, he confirmed that even where we are right now this year, those ending fund balances are not looking good. So we do believe that we're definitely going to see a real drop between $7 to $10 million in beginning fund balance. There's still a lot of expenditures throughout the spring. It's difficult to exactly tell where we're going to land here. But without significant cuts, fund balances reserves will be spent down within 2 years due to expenditures outpacing revenues. So kind of when that expenditure line crosses over revenue, if it's 7 to 10 million this year, the next year it could double, right? It could be 14 to 20 just because the personnel costs are so expensive. So that's why you can't just, part of the role of the budget committee is to know the long-term forecast too, because you can't just balance this year's budget knowing that we have a $9 million PERS hit, right? Next year, we need to balance for the future as well. And so that's a large portion of this, why we're doing this and why we're trying to be transparent about this. You may be saying, probably by now you understand, why this is decreasing, but funding levels have not kept up with expenditures. Specifically, the state school fund cannot keep up with personnel costs. The state school fund grows at an average kind of annual rate of about 4.7%. If you were to subtract out the ESSER, probably closer to 5.5. Even with holding personnel flat, not increasing FTE, the personnel expenditures alone, grow at probably around 8%. When you think about the 2.7% steps, the budget this year is a 3.3% bargain COLA. The PERS rates are anywhere to 1% to 4%, depending on the biennium, and the recent insurance caps included. So when you think about personnel being 85% of our expenditures, that curve, the slope of that curve every year is at 8%, and the slope of our revenue curve is at 5%. So of course you're gonna go over them. It's kind of basic there. But utility rates and fees have skyrocketed as well. Digital curriculum is more costly. We've done some state mandated adoptions that have been costly and, unprecedented expenditures there. Inflation rates increased supplies by 3.5% and higher during the pandemic. In addition, the ESSER funding did drop off, decreasing revenues and making it difficult to retain those former staffing ratios. I will say I don't think our community really knows this, but we have been cutting, attrition base for the last 3 years, over 100 positions, I'm sure of that. We don't really make a big deal about it. It's not something, but that is, millions and millions of dollars, probably over $16-17 million when you think of attrition over the last few years. So we have been kind of cutting into what that was for ESSER, but unfortunately that slope continues to curve over. So a visual aid or graphical look at the long-term forecast can be helpful. And this is going to be exactly what we kind of talked about earlier. Where there's all of our revenues, that's our general fund, state school fund revenues, and there is our other revenues that we talked about, and we're going to put it into that single line on the right-hand side. Getting tired here. On the left hand, and on this next graph, we'll kind of look at all of our expenditure assumptions that we spent the time going for, and we'll translate that into a graph as well, a line, and then we'll put them together. And unfortunately, we want the revenue line to be over the expenditure line, and that's not the case. Moving in fiscal year 26 and 27, you can see there's a gap forming there. Again, as Director Lynch pointed out, our assumptions right now are based off flat. We know that we can't do this, right? Those two lines, you can't legally have lines like that. You have to have a balanced budget. Only the federal government can print money. So we have to balance, and we're going to balance. But again, this is just kind of see what the gap is year over year right there. And so that's kind of the easiest way to look at it. Down here, on this next slide, we're kind of adding in the fund balance, conservative fund balance based on the estimates we had. And you can see that a negative reserve is obviously impossible, but you can see in fiscal year 29 in this forecast, you'd be at, negative 27 million. So again, you need to make adjustments now. Yes, sorry. You need to make adjustments now to fix for those years and probably in future years as well. Here I'm going to add in our policy, which is our 5% reserve requirement. We don't actually need a balance to zero. We need a balance to this 5% reserve requirement. And that reserve requirement is mostly a cash flow requirement so that we can pay our personnel. I'm not even sure that reserve requirement is large enough. I'll be honest, I'm looking at the next couple of years, and even if we stay at 5% with the rate that expenditures are growing in personnel, we might be looking at having to take some actions to be able to pay in October because we don't receive our property tax money until November. So that's our hardest year cash flow wise. So I'm pretty concerned about that. But right now you can see that 5% reserve level kind of grows. It's around 13-14 million in fiscal year 29, and we're still down by 29 million or so based on this model. So, or 27 million. Any questions on any of this so far? We're just kind of putting it all together graphically.
Dan, do you have kind of would like an 8% be cover that? Like, the 5% feeling pretty nervous about that 5% level being able to cover. What feels confident?
Yeah, I think we'd have to do a little bit more analysis on that to really see going out into fiscal year 28, where I'm really worried about cash flow and not being able to cover personnel. But then we need to look at fiscal year 29. It depends on the cuts we make now and cuts we make in the future years as well. And, you know, I think something that we'd have to consider is potentially whatever that policy is, whether it's 7.5% or 8%. It's really hard to enact a policy like that all at one point in time because you end up having to cut more personnel to get to that policy. So there's different ways of doing it. Would you go from 5 to 5.5 to 6 to 6.5 and do it over time? But we'd need to do a full analysis. My guess is somewhere around the 7.5 to 8 would cover for a time period. But again, you know, I think as Director Olson said in a meeting earlier this year, do we really want to bump up reserve when we're cutting? And it's probably very prudent, and also there's pros and cons, right? So it's a larger conversation. So the general fund operations graphical long-term forecast, just to give you an idea on kind of how that slope is going. I've zoomed in on this, and so this is why in order to balance the budget this year and for future years, we do need to cut operational and personnel costs. I can say at the time when we were doing this budget, it looked like FY27, the requested was going to come in at about 9.7 million ending fund balance, which would have left us short by 2.8 or 2.7 million. Now that we've done, you know, additional review of the requested, I think it's probably going to come in at 11.4, plus then we're going to do some non-personnel related cuts on top of that. So this slide will be updated certainly when we do the proposed budget, but the trend remains. You're going from 21 to 11 million. And the slope of that decrease increases the following year, right? And so that's why we have to make adjustments this year. Most districts in Oregon are facing this. Again, I'll just say many much more severely than us. Eugene, 30 million, Salem, 20, Portland, 50 million, Reynolds, Hillsborough. And I'm sure that there will be more as the budget process goes along. So this is actually when you put it out to 5 years. And I really thought we'd be closer and this would be bigger. I apologize. I really did. Oh, it's great on that side. No, so historically revenues have been greater than expenditures and ending funding balance was above the requirement. You know, all things are pointing to a $7 to $10 million drop in fund balance in fiscal year 27. We do project that those expenditures continue to outpace revenues, leading to rapid decline in the ending fund balance. Without multiple years of expenditure reductions or significant additional revenues, the district will not be able to maintain the 5% reserve requirements, have cash flow in October, or be fiscally responsible. And what I mean about fiscally responsible is, sure, this committee could come together and adopt a budget that's 5% right now, you know, 12.4, but that wouldn't be fiscally responsible because next year we'd be negative, right? And so we really, when we're talking about being fiscally responsible, we want to make sure that that gray curve and those yellow curves for all of our 5-year forecasts are aligned. Let's talk a little bit more about that. In order to achieve the 5% reserve requirement and have cash flow for payroll and be fiscally responsible, you know, we need to make up quite a big gap. You know, you can probably see if I go back that the scale here is 50 million, right? And so that yellow line in fiscal year 30 is at negative 50 million, right? And the reserve requirement at fiscal year 30 is close to 15 or 16 million. So the total gap is, you know, $65 million there. And again, you know, you cut now, that's 1 million, and in 3 years, that's 3.2 million. So while this graph looks pretty bad, you can do some things pretty quickly that turn this curve up. And I just wanted to put that out there. So, so the more that is cut in earlier years, less that needs to be cut in subsequent years. We kind of been over the million to 3.2 million in 3 years' time. We also have a duty to be responsible and not cut too much because we know certain variables like fiscal year 28 state school funding and future years compensation packages, we don't know those yet. You know, next fiscal year 28 is when we'll do the compensation packages, and if they go with a lower COLA, this line, you know, this line changes quite a bit. If they go with a higher COLA, you know, the line goes farther down, and so part of that is going to be in bargaining. And I would actually say, and I should say, that the the compensation piece of this, specifically the COLA, has a larger impact. A 1% COLA increase or decrease has a larger impact than a 1% state school fund decrease or increase. So when you talk about, it's really a two-factor thing. It's where does the state come in with its state school funding, and it's where do we land compensation for all staff. And so we're working very diligently with the superintendent and executive leadership team to model many different forecasts, but I would say, this is kind of the razor's edge. Certainly you could cut a lot in 1 year and be fiscally stable for some time. And also we're talking about real people's jobs. We're talking about not having an interruption in current service level. One graduating class has this many teachers, another graduating class has this many. Is that fair to our students? And also, I'll just say, we don't know what the SSF funding is going to be, and we don't know what that compensation is, so it might be a little premature just to, if those things come back, and unfortunately they're not great next year, then we can deal at that point in time, but there is a little bit of that.
I want to jump in on that, and I think it's important to know that every bit of these long-term forecasts are built on assumptions that we can't control. And part of what I believe our responsibility is to jump on the balcony and say, okay, in a perfect world, forget about the budget for a minute, the experience of our students should be that 1 year's worth of taxes pay for 1 year's worth of learning. And fixing a budget should be the responsibility of the adults to be done behind the scenes, and making sure those adjustments are done without having a negative impact as much as we can control on the experiences of our students. And so when we talk about what's the right way to do this, there are so many ways to do this. And I think one of the things that we've talked about, our executive leadership team has talked about a lot, is how do you continue to insulate our students from the impact of budget adjustments so that their experience isn't dramatically impacted by any adult decisions, and we are still maximizing student outcomes along the way. And so how we step into the conversations for this budget as it pertains to being a component of the 5-year plan, knowing what the next biennium would be very helpful. Knowing what bargaining impacts would be very helpful. And so none of that can be done now. And so to assume we know what we've run, I don't know how many different plays out on this, and there are substantial different outcomes based upon how this all plays out. And so when we present to you all over the process of the next few months about what this might be, part of what we're going to say is we believe that this is the most prudent direction going forward that doesn't negatively impact our kids. We could do this right now today, cut $12 to $14 million and never have to talk about this again. But our students would feel this dramatically, immediately if we did that, and I think that that is a mistake.
So that was one of the questions I was going to ask, because you've heard about districts around the state who are like doing mid-year cuts. And, one particular district, my mid in Springfield, who is redoing high schoolers' schedules mid-year. And like, that is something, Director Lynch and I have talked about it. Like, if I were a parent in that district, I would be recalling every single board member, signing everything I could to make sure that that didn't happen, because of the direct impact on students and their long-term future and plans. So it sounds like you are all very aware of that, and you are doing everything you possibly can so that we're never going to have to do mid-year cuts, hopefully, and rearrange student schedules.
Yeah, that would be in my mind. I don't want to speak ill of anybody else, but those kinds of examples are, I think, knee-jerk to some extent of poor preparation. We've done 3 years of this already, and we've mapped it. We think that there's this year plus 2 more to get into a slot that doesn't feel like we're having these conversations anymore. And so how do we shave it? How do we get it down to, we're looking at a barrier we're getting ready to crash into. Can we slow down before we get to it so that when we hit it, it's just a bump rather than a major collision? And that's what I believe is the most responsible experience for our community. And it also helps our community see and understand and recognize this board and this budget committee's commitment to, we have to be as prudent as we can, but we also owe these students the best experience. And so how do you hit that in the exact way we should? And that's what we're talking about bringing in front of you all.
I think the added sort of, I don't know, all of these decisions have like pros and cons to each, right? And one of them is that by drawing it out or sort of doing this so that students have the least amount of sort of big hit, one of the potential negatives of that is that the folks who are in the system are always like, yeah, you're always like, you're always saying you're cutting. Like, is this just a, sort of a boy who cried wolf type of thing? Like that if that's always the narrative, then it doesn't really feel like, oh, yikes, we actually are in kind of a dire strait. And so that really is upon us to communicate that well, and communicate that often and frequently to make sure that the narrative around this is about student experience at the end of the day. How do we maintain that? That's a big deal.
And I'll stop talking after I say this, well, at least for a while. We are 2,200 students below our max. We've cut 100 teachers, not 100 teachers, 100 staff over the last 3 years. And so if you were to have, there are 2,200 student school districts that have 400 staff, right? Like this is, like we should be doing this. We are not 18,600 students. And while we're decreasing the total number of staff, we're also having increases in the number of ELL students and the number of students requiring special supports. And so you have to also increase those supports while you're reducing staff. And this is exactly what we should be doing over time. And so getting to that point where we are spot on is the goal in the end run. And so by the time this will be done, it will be 6 years of this redistribution of how our staffing is spread for our roughly 15,800 to 16,000 students in 2 years from now.
I think one other thing that I'll just add is that as you all are aware, and Dan alluded to a lot of different efficiency markers that Ben Lapine is working on changing, that also creates a situation where we may be cutting in certain areas and hiring in other areas because we're trying to make our efficiency and our programs, just systems, accurate. And so that can feel confusing in all of this too. So again, that communication is really key.
Yeah, I would say in all scenarios, we'd still have an ending fund balance across our sub-funds and general funds in the 20 million, for next year, in and around that range. So I would feel confident saying, unless the state school fund withheld 2 months of payments, we wouldn't have to, which would be unprecedented. We wouldn't have to do any kind of mid-year. I will, caution this committee though, like there are a lot of 28 variables that we don't know. So if we set up a plan right now that kind of evenly distributes cuts for 3-4 years, so that students don't feel the impact, but then we come back next year and SSF isn't at 11%, it's at 9%. Compensation part, is not where we had hoped to land it or something like that, then yeah, then it's not going to be, what? Yeah, best laid plan. It's not going to be a mid-year cut, but it's going to be next fiscal year's budget where we have to make some pretty large changes. So just to show you a little bit of the sensitivity that I was talking about earlier, the graph on the left, that was a scenario with 11% and 8.25% personnel growth. The below scenario, the graph on the last page that was at 50 million. Under was at 8.25%. This one is at 10% SSF and 8.75 personnel growth. And I believe that number was somewhere around 58 million reduction. So you can see like how sensitive it goes, especially out on time. Alternatively, an 11% SSF assumption with the 7.5 personnel is somewhere, I think, around $34 or $36 million drop. So it's a $14 million drop. And we're talking about, just to be clear, we're talking about like a 1% assumption difference between revenues and personnel there. So it's very sensitive. That has to do with 85% of our expenditures being personnel. So we'll see where it lands, and really next year is going to be that kind of key year, but we definitely need to make sure that we have the fund balance to put us in a good position next year.
And again, these are personnel cost growth, not growth in number of personnel.
Yes.
If I were to make this chart, I would probably clarify. You're not talking about growing the staff by 8.75%.
Correct. Yeah, we're just talking about, again, that would be with flat staffing and depending where the compensation assumptions are. Okay. All right, so financial solutions, there's kind of like three main financial solutions. There's obviously more than that. I want you guys to know that we are constantly exploring, whether it's real estate sales or having a little bit more robust marketing here so that we can maybe capture some more enrollment. Those are always things that we're talking about in some cases that we put in funds for the budget. But you can significantly reduce the expenditures, so that's cuts, right? It doesn't change the slope of the expenditure line. You're still having personnel compensation increases around 8%, but it lowers the entire line, and you can lower it below the revenue line and kind of like restart, and then it'll pass again. The second thing you can do is evaluate compensation packages, and you can kind of, if the compensation package comes in lower, you can decrease the slope of the line. And sometimes you can do that enough so that the slope of the revenue line, the SSF, curbs over the slope of the downward increasing expenditure line. And then the third is you would have to do significant revenues at this point. So present a local option levy to the community, would allow maintenance of current service level. It would allow us so that, maybe kids aren't having that incremental change in experience, and then it would significantly increase revenue to the district. We will likely, in all the assumptions that I've made, need to do a pretty serious combination of at least two of those, whether it's the two expenditure or it's a revenue, and we do something, maybe on the expenditure side to make sure that the local option levy isn't too high. In almost all scenarios, you need to do kind of two of those three. So those would be the major things that you could do for financial solutions. Like I said, we've looked at selling excess real estate. We've looked at marketing, enrollment, trying to diversify our revenue flows, but ultimately 95% comes from the state school fund. So we're there. Any questions on any of that? Okay, almost right at 7 o'clock. Key takeaways, state school fund is 95% of the general fund revenues. Personnel makes up 85% of our expenditures. Budget assumptions include 4.1% increase in year-over-year SSF, a slight decrease in enrollment, but ultimately maintaining that 2.9% of total ADMW across the state, a 3.3% COLA, 2.7% personnel steps, and a 3.15 vacancy assumption, which is our highest yet. And we did meet with departments individually and went line by line assessing historical actuals to accurately budget for fiscal year 27 non-personnel expenditures. I will also say part of this that I wasn't necessarily planning talking about is we've already made, well over $1 million in non-personnel related cuts, whether it's, curriculum or whether it's, Paul Dean's teams in maintenance and safety and IT. And so we've already done that second level of cuts. Now we're looking at kind of the personnel, what's left in terms of personnel cuts, and can we make that through attrition and doing some more modeling. Expenditures are outpacing revenues in fiscal year 27, and they will continue to outpace. We need to make significant reductions and increase our financial stability for future years. The long-term forecast, you guys will probably get to see that more. It's a tool we use to model financials in future years and determine the appropriate course of action. And a local option levy, cost reductions, and compensation agreement changes are all partial solutions to what we find happening here with expenditures outpacing revenues. Okay. Questions? Look at the time. You have 2 minutes. Yeah. And also, I appreciate it. This is new for us, so we've never done anything like this. Apollo was asking how many times have we done this? Like never. So we're trying to be more financially transparent and let you guys really get an inside look into what we're doing in the proposed budget and in our financials. So thank you all. Thank you for volunteering your time.
I'm just wondering if we have a timeline on when the next time would be that we would potentially introduce a local option levy to the community.
I think we need to just continue to look at the modeling, and I would guess, I'm going to speak for Dr. Cook here, but when we are in his office looking at the modeling and when we know more about fiscal year 28, if it's looking like it's really drastic and it's something that's going to seriously change student experience, then I think that becomes a very real option, and we have budgeted some funds in case during the course of fiscal year 27 we realize we need to do that, because it's actually a year-long process. I think one thing we learned last time was going out with 3 months is never going to work. At the county, they used to tell us you have to have 12 months and you have to go door by door and you have to have community meetings. So we do have 25,000 in there in the communications fund in case we do need to kind of look at polling communications and start that in fiscal year 27. But we still just kind of need to do a little bit more modeling and get an idea for where we're at. And it's also a very big conversation about board priorities and those things.
Any further questions? All right, hearing no questions, our next regular school board business meeting is scheduled for March 10th. And with that said, this meeting is adjourned.